The feather is not lying on the stone so much as appearing inside it. A faint dark line runs along the central shaft. Smaller lines branch away from it with a precision that looks almost too delicate for rock. Around it, the slab is pale and flat, split from a bed of ancient lake sediment in northeastern China, where the bottom mud once held still water. Drifting ash, dead insects, fish scales, leaves, and the small bodies of animals that changed how we understand dinosaurs. There is no skeleton at first, no skull rising from a quarry wall, no great femur heavy enough to require two people to lift it. Just a feather, pressed so thin that it seems closer to a stain than a fossil. Yet that stain belongs to a world where dinosaurs were not only heavy-footed giants on distant floodplains. They could be small, quick, warm, alert, and covered in structures that catch the light in ways we once gave only to birds. This is the Jehol Biota, an early Cretaceous ecosystem preserved mostly in the Yixian and Jiufotang formations of northeastern China. It is not Jurassic in age, despite the older sound of the channel name and the deep history it belongs to. It comes later, roughly between 130 and 120 million years ago, when the Mesozoic world had already changed many times, but when non-avian dinosaurs still dominated the land and the first great radiation of birds was unfolding beside them. The place was not a single lake, not a single forest, and not a single moment. It was a region of basins, volcanoes, shorelines, streams, low hills, and freshwater bodies that appeared and shifted across what are now Liaoning Province, northern Hebei, and nearby Inner Mongolia. The fossils come from a landscape where fire and water worked together. Volcanoes threw ash into the air. Lakes received it. Fine sediments settled over bodies before the ordinary violence of decay could completely erase them. What makes Jehol important is not simply that it has many fossils. Plenty of places have many fossils. Jehol matters because many of its fossils are complete, articulated, and preserved with details that are usually lost. Feathers remain as halos and outlines. Skin can leave impressions. Stomach contents can survive. In some cases, the shape of a meal, the line of a wing, or the last posture of a small animal still sits in the rock with enough clarity to move paleontology from guesswork into observation. If these journeys into the dinosaur age are why you came to Jurassical, subscribing keeps the next one within reach. Before Jehol, feathers belonged in the public imagination almost entirely to birds. Dinosaurs, even when they were accepted as active animals, were still often pictured as scaly figures, separated from robins and crows by an almost invisible wall. Then the rocks of Liaoning began to open. Skeletons appeared with filaments around them. Small theropods carried plumage. Early birds kept teeth, claws, and long tails. The wall between dinosaur and bird did not fall all at once, but stone by stone, fossil by fossil, it became harder to defend. The Jehol discoveries did not invent the idea that birds evolved from dinosaurs. That idea had roots deep in 19th century anatomy and grew stronger through later studies of theropod skeletons. What Jehol provided was something more intimate. It showed the soft covering of the body. It showed feathered dinosaurs that were not birds. It showed birds that still looked, in many details, unmistakably dinosaurian. It brought the argument out of bones alone and into the texture of the animal. Imagine the lake margin at dawn. The water is low and dark. Mist holds close to the surface. Conifers stand beyond the shore, their trunks rising from ground crowded with ferns, horsetails, Bennettitalians, ginkgos, and cycads. There is no grass underfoot in the modern sense. Flowers are present in the wider Early Cretaceous world, but they are not yet the dominant fabric of the landscape. The green here is older, stiffer, and more resinous. The air is not tropical in the easy way a modern viewer might expect. Some research suggests that parts of the Jehol region sat at elevation and endured cold winters. Feathers, in that setting, were not decoration alone. On small bodies, they were insulation. They held heat close to muscle and bone. They allowed activity when the morning air bit harder than a lizard's metabolism might comfortably allow. They were part of survival before they were part of flight. Near the water, a fish breaks the surface and leaves a circle that widens across the lake. Lecoptera, small and abundant, move in schools below. Insects drift and fall. A mayfly settles on the water and is taken. On the bank, a small dinosaur pauses with its head low, its tail stretched behind it, and a fringe of filaments along its body that would once have seemed impossible. It is not a bird. It is not quite like any animal alive today. Yet it is closer to a bird than to the lumbering reptile of old museum murals. Sinosauropteryx was one of the fossils that helped change everything. It was small, lightly built, and preserved with a coat of simple filamentous structures around the body and tail. These were not broad flight feathers. They were simpler, more hair-like, and they did not make the animal capable of flight. But their presence showed that feathers, or feather-like coverings, had deeper origins than powered flight itself. The body covering came first. The wing, in evolutionary terms, came later. That distinction matters. If feathers began as insulation or display, then flight did not appear because an animal suddenly needed wings. Evolution did not look ahead toward birds. It worked with what was already there. A filament that kept a small dinosaur warm could later become a display structure. A display feather could later be modified for balance, brooding, gliding, or steering. Only after many such steps could true flight feathers become part of a wing. Jehol also reminds us that the word feather covers more than one thing. Some feathers are simple filaments, some branch, some form veins, some are symmetrical and useful for insulation or display. Some are asymmetrical and suited for aerodynamic control. In the fossil record, these forms do not appear as a single neat ladder. They appear across different species, body regions, and ecological roles, as if evolution was exploring several possibilities at once. On one slab, the animal is a small body with a shadow around it. On another, a tail becomes banded. On another, long feathers trace the outline of a limb. Paleontologists do not hear the forest. They do not watch the animal breathe. But the stone gives enough to make the body less abstract. The dinosaur is no longer only a skeleton. It has edges. It has a surface. It has something that wind, water, and morning cold would have touched. The Jehol Biota is often called a Lagerstätte, a deposit of exceptional preservation. The term matters because ordinary fossilization is severe. Most animals die and vanish. Scavengers tear them open. Water scatters bones. Bacteria consume tissues. Sunlight, oxygen, and time do their quiet work. A typical fossil record favors hard parts, durable shells, large bones, and lucky burials. Jehol is different because it sometimes preserves bodies with the fragile information still attached. That preservation was not gentle in every case. Some fossils may record sudden deaths associated with volcanic events. Fine ash could fall into lakes. Toxic gases could gather. Pyroclastic material, floods, or rapid sedimentation may have overwhelmed animals on land or carried bodies into water. Scientists continue to debate exactly how all the preservation pathways worked, and the answer was probably not one single process. Jehol was a region, not a single disaster. The lakes themselves were important. Fine-grained lake sediments can settle in thin layers, especially in quiet water. If the deeper water becomes low in oxygen, bottom scavengers are limited, and a body that sinks into that setting has a better chance of remaining intact. A fish can lie with fins extended. A bird can preserve wing feathers. A dinosaur can keep the faint halo of its body covering. The lake bottom becomes a page, and sediment becomes the slow ink. Yet a page is still made by death. The beautiful fossils of Jehol are not peaceful illustrations. They are the remains of animals that stopped moving. Some may have been caught suddenly. Others may have drifted in after drowning or being washed from the shore. A small bird might have fallen from the air. A mammal might have died in a burrow or near the water. A fish might have suffocated as conditions changed beneath the surface. The result is a rare closeness. In most dinosaur-bearing rocks, the animal reaches us in fragments. A tooth, a vertebra, a weathered limb bone. Jehol often brings the whole animal forward. The skull is still attached to the neck. The hands remain folded near the chest. The tail curves behind the body. Feathers spread outward like a dark weather front around bones that would otherwise tell only part of the story. Jehol was early Cretaceous, but its importance reaches back into older questions about the dinosaur age. By this time, the first birds had already appeared in the Jurassic, and theropod dinosaurs had been experimenting with feathers for tens of millions of years. Jehol does not show the first feather. It does not show the first bird. What it shows is a later, richer, highly informative stage, when feathered dinosaurs and early birds had diversified into a range of forms living in the same region. That is why the place feels crowded in the mind. Not crowded like a modern city, but crowded with evolutionary proximity. A small predatory dinosaur with filamentous covering moves near a lake. A bird with a toothless beak lifts from a branch. Another bird still carries a long bony tail. A four-winged dromaeosaur glides or bounds through the trees. A tyrannosauroid with feathers walks through colder air than its famous later relatives would ever need to endure. The name Jehol comes from an older geographic term for the region, and the fossils had been known long before the great wave of feathered dinosaur discoveries. Early workers recognized fish, insects, and other lake fossils. But in the 1990s and after, new specimens from Liaoning transformed the region from a known fossil source into one of the most important windows ever opened onto Mesozoic life. The excitement was not just that dinosaurs had feathers, it was that many kinds of animals were preserved together. A fossil site that preserves one spectacular animal can change a classification. A fossil site that preserves an ecosystem can change a worldview. Jehol holds plants, fishes, frogs, salamanders, turtles, choristoderas, pterosaurs, mammals, birds, non-avian dinosaurs, insects, and more. Each group matters on its own, but their real strength is collective. They allow scientists to ask how the animals lived around one another, not just what each body looked like in isolation. A small fish in the lake does not know it is part of a future argument about bird origins. A mayfly does not know that its wings may one day be studied beside the feathers of a dinosaur. A mammal moving in the undergrowth does not know that its jaw and teeth will help reconstruct the hidden lives of early mammals. The animals are simply living in the morning, close to water, beneath a sky where both pterosaurs and birds can pass. That is one of the quiet powers of Jehol. It reduces the distance between categories: land, water, and air meet. Dinosaur, bird, and mammal meet. Disaster and preservation meet. A living ecosystem becomes a fossil archive because volcanoes, lakes, climate, and sediment happen to align in a way that almost never happens. From that alignment, an entire lost world comes back with its feathers still visible. To understand that world, we have to begin not with the famous animals, but with the place itself. The Jehol region was shaped by tectonic activity and volcanism during the early Cretaceous. Basins formed. Lava and ash entered the record. Lakes occupied low areas and received sediment from surrounding slopes. Forests grew on volcanic soils, near streams and shorelines, and on ground that could be productive one season and dangerous the next. Volcanic landscapes are not simply barren. After eruptions, ash can weather into mineral-rich soil. Lakes can form in basins created or modified by tectonic movement. Plants recolonize. Insects arrive. Fish live in the water. Reptiles, mammals, and dinosaurs use the shorelines. The same volcanic activity that threatens life can also build the conditions that support it and preserve its remains. Jehol was not an ash-covered wasteland. It was a living region under volcanic influence. Picture a slope above one of the lakes. Conifers stand in uneven clusters. Ginkgo leaves tremble in a cool wind. Low plants crowd damp ground, where water seeps down toward the shore. A small dinosaur pushes through stems, head turning in quick motions. Its nostrils test the air. It does not move like a monster. It moves like an animal with hunger, temperature, balance, and fear. The feathering on its body shifts as it passes between light and shade. The climate of Jehol has been reconstructed in different ways, and it likely varied across time and local geography. The broad picture includes seasonal conditions and evidence consistent with relatively cool intervals, perhaps with cold winters in some upland settings. That detail changes the way the feathers feel. They are no longer only a dramatic visual surprise. They become practical. In a cold dawn, a coat of filaments is a biological tool. A feathered dinosaur in Jehol is not a bird pretending to be a dinosaur, and it is not a reptile decorated with bird parts. It is its own animal. Its covering belongs to its own life. It may display to mates, warn rivals, break up the outline of the body, or hold warmth near the skin. Some feathers might help with balance or movement through vegetation. Some might have no flight function at all and still be essential. That is a useful restraint to keep. Feathers do not mean flight. Wings do not always mean powered flight. A feathered dinosaur may still be a ground runner, a climber, a glider, a display animal, or a predator that never leaves the earth except in a leap. Jehol teaches this because it preserves many stages near one another. It shows that evolution does not arrange animals for our convenience. It produces overlapping forms, partial solutions, and bodies that resist clean labels. Along the lake, the mud holds footprints for a while before water softens them. The prints are not always preserved. Most vanish before they can become fossils. But the animals that made them were there. Small theropods walked the shore. Birds landed and lifted away. Turtles dragged themselves through the shallows. Fish turned below the surface. Leaves fell. Ash settled. A whole world kept leaving evidence that almost always disappeared. The fossil record is therefore not a full record. Even Jehol, with all its abundance, is selective. It favors animals that died in the right place and were buried under the right conditions. It favors still water, fine sediment, sudden burial, and chemical settings that slowed decay. The living ecosystem was larger, messier, and more active than the slabs can show. For every animal preserved, countless others left nothing. Still, what survived is extraordinary. Sinosauropteryx showed simple filamentous covering. Caudipteryx displayed prominent feathers on the arms and tail while retaining a body plan that was not suited for strong flight. Microraptor preserved long feathers on both arms and legs, raising questions about gliding and aerial control. Confuciusornis showed a toothless beak and long paired tail feathers in some individuals. Jeholornis kept a long bony tail and evidence tied to plant food. Each fossil opened a different door. These doors did not all open into the same room. Some led toward the origin of birds. Some led toward feather function. Some led toward early mammal ecology. Some led toward ancient lake systems. Others led toward color, because microscopic structures in fossil feathers can sometimes be interpreted as melanosomes, the pigment-bearing structures that help produce colors in living feathers. In certain fossils, the past is not only shaped, it may be faintly colored. Color is one of the easiest things to lose. Bone can remain after muscle has vanished. Teeth can outlast skin. But color seems almost too intimate for deep time. A banded tail, a dark body, a pattern on feathers, even cautiously reconstructed, changes how the animal enters the mind. It is no longer a gray outline. It has a surface that other animals could see. It had signals, camouflage, display, and perhaps the small visual negotiations of daily life. Sinosauropteryx is often discussed in this context because studies have suggested it had a banded tail and possibly countershading, with darker coloration above and lighter below. Countershading is common in living animals, and can help reduce visibility by offsetting the way light falls across the body. If that interpretation is correct, then this small dinosaur was not only feathered, but visually adapted to its environment in ways that feel familiar from living animals. The details of fossil color require caution. Melanosomes can preserve, but interpretation depends on microscopic structure, chemistry, comparison with living birds, and the condition of the fossil. Not every dark patch is color. Not every feather impression gives a reliable palette. But the fact that scientists can ask these questions at all is remarkable. Jehol does not give us the whole animal back, but it gives enough that even color becomes a scientific possibility. The lake keeps appearing beneath all of this. A slab splits open. On one side is the body. On the other is its counterpart, the negative and positive surfaces of a life divided by a tool in a quarry. A feather lies on both halves. A fish becomes two impressions. A small dinosaur is held between surfaces like a pressed plant. The stone is not dramatic by itself. It is quiet. The drama is in what it managed not to lose. To walk into Jehol is to enter a forest that is familiar only in outline. There are trunks, shade, leaf litter, fallen branches, damp places, dry places, and the narrow corridors made by animals moving along habitual routes. But the plants are not arranged like a modern park or woodland. No grass spreads into lawns. No oaks lean over the water. No flowering shrubs brighten the understory in the way they would later in the Cretaceous and Cenozoic. Conifers were important parts of the vegetation, and so were ginkgos, cycads, bennettitalians, ferns, and horsetails. The mixture varied by place and time, but the overall world was still dominated by older plant lineages. Seeds could be carried, eaten, buried, or lost. Leaves fell into water and became impressions. Wood entered streams and lake margins. The plant fossils are not background decoration. They are the food base, the architecture, and the seasonal clock of the ecosystem. A small herbivorous dinosaur near the shore would have experienced the forest first as edible surfaces and obstacles. A frond at head height, a cone-bearing branch overhead, a patch of wet mud where scent gathers, a fallen log that hides insects, a darker thicket where a predator could wait. The vegetation shaped movement. It separated animals from one another. It made some paths easy and others expensive. Every dinosaur body was moving through a landscape built by plants. Psittacosaurus, one of the most common dinosaurs in parts of the Jehol record, was not a giant. But it was important. It belonged to the ceratopsian line, the wider group that would later include horned dinosaurs such as Triceratops. In Jehol, however, Psittacosaurus was small to medium-sized, beaked, often bipedal or partly quadrupedal depending on age and activity, and well-suited to cropping tough vegetation near the ground. A Psittacosaurus at the lake edge would not look like the grand horned animals of the late Cretaceous. It would be more compact, alert, with a parrot-like beak and a body close enough to the ground to disappear quickly behind low plants. Some specimens from related contexts have shown extraordinary soft tissue information, including bristle-like structures along the tail in one famous fossil. Even where such details are rare, the animal reminds us that early ceratopsians were already experimenting with forms very different from their later descendants. Psittacosaurus also appears in one of the most striking predator-prey records from the region. A mammal called Repenomamus has been found with remains of a juvenile Psittacosaurus in its stomach contents. This does not mean mammals ruled the dinosaur world, and it does not mean Repenomamus routinely killed healthy young dinosaurs. But it does show that the old image of Mesozoic mammals as harmless shadows is too simple. Some were active, capable, and ecologically important. Repenomamus was large for a Mesozoic mammal, but still modest by later mammalian standards. In a landscape where dinosaurs held most large-bodied roles, even a badger-sized or dog-sized mammal becomes notable. Its teeth and body suggest a predatory or omnivorous life. It may have scavenged. It may have hunted small vertebrates. The fossil with Psittacosaurus remains gives one rare moment where diet is not only inferred from teeth, it is preserved inside the body. That stomach content is a hard thing to picture gently. A young dinosaur, swallowed or scavenged, a mammal that fed and then died before digestion erased the evidence. A lake or sudden burial that kept the association intact. The scene is not a battle painted with thunder, it is smaller and more ordinary. Hunger, chance, a body taken into another body, and then both passed into stone. Around the same lakes, insects filled the air and vegetation. Beetles moved over bark. Mayflies emerged near water in brief adult lives. Dragonflies hunted above the shore. Cockroaches, true bugs, and other small arthropods worked through leaf litter and plant surfaces. Their importance was enormous because they linked plants, fish, amphibians, pterosaurs, birds, and small dinosaurs in countless daily exchanges of energy. Insects are often treated as details in dinosaur stories, but in Jehol, they are part of the reason the ecosystem feels alive. They fed birds, they fed small theropods, they fed frogs and salamanders. Their larvae lived in water and connected the lake bottom to the air above it. When insects were buried in fine sediment, they carried with them information about climate, water chemistry, and the plant communities that supported them. The water itself held fish, and the fish fed larger animals. Lycoptera was especially characteristic, a small freshwater fish often associated with the classic Jehol assemblage. Schools of these fish would have moved through lake water, turning in quick flashes, feeding, avoiding larger fish, avoiding diving birds or reptiles. When mass mortality events occurred, fish could settle in numbers, their bodies lying on bedding plains like scattered leaves. The presence of abundant freshwater fish tells us that Jehol was not only a dinosaur site with some lake mud around it. It was a lake-centered ecosystem, or more accurately, a series of lake-centered ecosystems. The lakes were habitats in their own right. Their oxygen levels, salinity, depth, temperature, and seasonal changes shaped which organisms could live there, and which bodies could be preserved there after death. A bird taking a fish from the surface leaves almost nothing behind. A splash closes. Ripples spread. The bird lifts to a branch or shoreline stone. The fish is swallowed, and the event disappears into metabolism. But if that bird dies soon afterward and sinks into the lake, the last meal may remain. In a place like Jehol, ecology sometimes survives not as a theory, but as a small cluster of bones or scales inside a ribcage. Stomach contents should always be interpreted with restraint. A final meal may not represent an animal's whole diet. A scavenged item may be mistaken for hunted prey if context is poor. Digestion changes what remains. But when many lines of evidence agree, tooth form, gut contents, limb anatomy, habitat, and comparison with living animals, a more reliable picture begins to form. Jehol provides enough rare evidence to make those comparisons unusually strong. Some of the lakes may have frozen in winter, at least in colder phases or higher settings. That possibility changes the sound of the world. It adds mornings when the shore mud is stiff, when breath would plume from warm-bodied animals, when fish move more slowly below dark water, when a small feathered dinosaur stands fluffed and still before beginning to forage. The dinosaur age was not one endless tropical afternoon. Cold matters because bodies pay for it. A large animal can hold heat through mass. A small animal loses heat quickly. Feathers and filamentous coverings help shift that balance. A tiny theropod without insulation must either retreat, slow down, or burn energy at a dangerous rate. A covered body has more options. It can move earlier. It can hunt longer. It can survive nights that would punish bare skin. This does not mean every Jehol dinosaur was fully warm-blooded in the same way as a modern bird or mammal. Metabolism in extinct animals is complicated, and different dinosaur groups likely occupied different points along a spectrum. But feathers strongly connect to insulation, and insulation usually matters most when a body produces heat worth retaining. In small theropods, that connection is difficult to ignore. The old image of a cold, sluggish dinosaur fades when you put one at the edge of a cold lake with feathers along its body. It is not necessarily frantic or mammal-like. It is not simply a bird either. It is an animal tuned to its own physiology, holding heat, moving with purpose, responding to weather, and living through mornings that would have been felt in skin, feather, lung, and muscle. Then there is Yutyrannus, a reminder that feathers were not limited to little animals. This early tyrannosauroid from the Yixian Formation was much larger than the small feathered theropods that first captured attention. It was not Tyrannosaurus rex, and it lived far earlier than that famous predator, but it belonged to the wider Tyrannosauroid line. Its preserved filamentous covering showed that large predatory dinosaurs could also carry feathery insulation. Yutyrannus complicates simple rules. Large animals are often less dependent on insulation because their body mass helps retain heat, but a large animal in a cool environment may still benefit from a covering. The feathers of Yutyrannus may not have looked like the tidy plumage of a modern bird. They were likely filamentous and shaggy in appearance. But on a predator several meters long, they would have changed the entire visual impression of the animal. Imagine a large theropod moving between conifers, not naked and lizard-like, but carrying a coat that ruffles along the neck, torso, and tail. The head is still dangerous. The jaws still matter. The feet still press into mud with weight and balance. But the surface of the animal belongs to a different understanding of dinosauria. It is not less dinosaurian because it is feathered. It is more accurately dinosaurian because of it. Dilong, another early tyrannosauroid from Liaoning deposits, adds to that picture on a smaller scale. It showed evidence of filamentous integument and helped support the view that feathers or feather-like coverings were present in early members of the tyrannosauroid lineage. Later large tyrannosaurids may have varied in their body covering, and the evidence is not identical across the group. But Jehol makes it impossible to imagine tyrannosaur origins without considering feathers. The tyrannosaur story, seen through Jehol, begins not with a colossal late Cretaceous skull in a North American badland, but with smaller and earlier predators in forests and lake basins. Their descendants would become some of the largest land predators ever known. But here, in the early Cretaceous of northeastern China, the lineage still has a different scale, a different climate, and a different surface. A lineage is not a straight corridor. It is a branching forest. Most branches end. Some persist. A small feathered tyrannosauroid near a Jehol lake is not waiting to become Tyrannosaurus. It is complete in itself. But for us, looking backward, its bones and feathers let us see that the later giant was part of a history richer and stranger than a single skull full of teeth. Other theropods in Jehol show different experiments. Beipiaosaurus, a therizinosaur, belonged to one of the strangest branches of theropod evolution. Therizinosaurs were related to carnivorous dinosaurs, but many moved toward herbivory or omnivory, with long arms, large claws, and bodies that could look almost ungainly compared with lean predators. Beipiaosaurus preserved long filamentous structures, sometimes described as broad, ribbon-like feathers, adding another form to the diversity of dinosaur plumage. A therizinosaur body asks a different question. What happens when a theropod lineage, with its predatory ancestry, begins to use its arms, claws, jaws, and gut for other purposes? The claws may help pull branches, defend against threats, or interact with vegetation. The feathers may display or insulate. The animal may not fit the usual categories of hunter and hunted. It becomes another reminder that dinosaur evolution was not a set of fixed roles, but a long series of experiments. Caudipteryx is equally important in a different way. It had prominent feathers on the arms and tail, yet its proportions suggest that it was not a strong flyer. It has often been central to discussions about display, feather evolution, and the blurred border between non-avian dinosaurs and birds. Its body was compact, its arms feathered, its tail adorned. It looked bird-like in some ways, but its life was likely spent mostly on the ground. That combination can feel contradictory only if feathers are assumed to exist for flight. Once that assumption is removed, Caudipteryx becomes easier to understand. Feathers could signal. They could cover eggs. They could help balance. They could make the animal look larger. They could help regulate temperature. Many living birds use feathers for functions beyond flight, and some cannot fly at all. Jehol shows that this multifunctional history began before birds became the dominant feathered animals. A Caudipteryx walking along the lakeshore would carry a kind of visual announcement. The tail feathers would move behind it. The arm feathers would shift as it balanced, turned, or displayed. In life, the feathers were not fossils or arguments. They were part of posture, mating, threat, recognition, and daily motion. They made the animal visible to others long before they made it visible to us. Protarchaeopteryx, another feathered animal from the region, also carried significant plumage while retaining a non-modern body plan. These animals became important because they showed that feathers were spread across several non-avian dinosaur lineages close to birds. They did not represent a single oddity. They represented a pattern. The more Liaoning fossils appeared, the less exceptional feathered dinosaurs seemed, and the more incomplete the older scaly image became. Scientific revolutions are sometimes described as sudden, but they often work by accumulation. One fossil can be dismissed as unusual. 2 can be debated. 10 begin to reshape expectation. Jehol produced enough feathered forms that the question changed. It was no longer simply whether some dinosaurs had feathers. It became which dinosaurs had which kinds of feathers, where on the body, for what functions, and under what ecological pressures. The rock did not answer those questions in a single voice. It answered in details. A filament along a spine, a fan on a tail, a set of long feathers attached to a hind limb, a preserved wing, a skull with teeth, a beak without teeth, a small body curled in a resting posture. Each detail was partial, but together they made the old boundary between dinosaur and bird feel less like a wall and more like a shoreline. And on shorelines, edges shift. Water rises. Mud dries. Tracks appear and disappear. Animals cross from trees to ground, from ground to air, from air to water. Jehol was full of such edges, the edge between lake and forest, the edge between volcanic danger and ecological richness, the edge between bird and non-avian dinosaur, the edge between ordinary death and extraordinary preservation. The Jehol birds deserve their own attention because they were not simply modern birds placed in an old setting. Many were stem birds or early members of extinct avian lineages with combinations of traits unfamiliar today. Some retained teeth. Some had clawed fingers. Some had long bony tails, while others had shortened tails with feather fans. Some appear adapted to perching. Others were linked to fish or seeds. The early bird world was already diverse but not yet modern. Confuciusornis is among the best known. It had a toothless beak, making it look in one respect more modern than Archaeopteryx, but it retained clawed fingers on the wing. Some individuals had long paired tail feathers, likely involved in display. Many specimens are known, enough that scientists can discuss growth, variation, possible sexual differences, and the ecology of a bird that lived in numbers near the lakes and forests of Jehol. A Confuciusornis perched above the water would have been small enough to vanish among branches, but striking enough in the right light to catch another bird's attention. The beak would open and close without teeth. The wing claws, so strange to modern eyes, would still belong naturally to the animal. If it carried long tail feathers, they would trail behind like narrow banners, not for us, but for other members of its own world. Confuciusornis also helps show that early bird evolution was not a simple march toward the modern form. A beak appeared while wing claws remained. Teeth disappeared in one lineage while persisting in others. tail feathers became important display structures before every bird had the compact tail skeleton of modern birds. The Jehol record presents evolution as a mosaic, with traits appearing, disappearing, and combining in different ways across related animals. That mosaic is exactly what should be expected when a major body plan is being refined across millions of years. It is tempting to call Confuciusornis primitive, but that word can mislead. The animal was not half-finished. It was adapted to its own environment, with its own feeding methods, flight abilities, display structures, and growth patterns. Modern birds are not the goal toward which every earlier bird was moving. They are one surviving outcome among many. Jehol is full of outcomes that worked for a time, some successfully enough to become abundant, and then vanished without living descendants. Jeholornis shows a different kind of bird. It retained a long, bony tail, unlike the shortened tail of most modern birds. Yet it was clearly part of the early avian radiation. Some specimens have been associated with seeds, suggesting a diet that included plant material. This is important because it places birds not only in the air, but inside plant communities, interacting with reproductive structures, fruits or fruit-like organs, and seeds in ways that could influence dispersal and feeding ecology. A Jeholornis moving through branches would have carried the past behind it, literally in the form of that long tail. The tail made it look less like a sparrow and more like an animal still close to the dinosaurian body plan from which birds emerged. Yet the wings were real. The feathers were real. The perching, feeding, and moving through trees were real. It belonged to a stage of bird history that no longer exists, except as a pattern in stone. Enanche ornithines, sometimes called opposite birds because of the structure of certain shoulder bones, were among the most successful bird groups of the Cretaceous. They are well represented in Jehol deposits, and many were small, perching, and ecologically varied. They did not survive the end Cretaceous mass extinction, but during their time, they were major components of avian diversity. Their fossils show that birds were not waiting quietly in the background while dinosaurs dominated. They were already diversifying. Some Jehol birds show evidence of aquatic or fish-eating habits. Eunornis, for example, has been associated with fish remains and a body plan suited to more powerful flight than some earlier birds. In these animals, the lakes were not just hazards that preserved bodies after death, they were feeding grounds. A bird could launch from a shore, skim above water, seize prey, and return to a perch, taking energy from the lake into the trees. Flight ability varied among Jehol birds and their close relatives. Some were probably capable flyers. Others may have been limited, specialized, or still refining the mechanics of powered flight. The presence of feathers alone does not settle the issue. Paleontologists examine the sternum, shoulder joint, wing proportions, feather asymmetry, muscle attachment points, and body mass. Jehol offers enough specimens that flight can be studied not as one origin event, but as a set of abilities distributed across different species. Microraptor takes that distribution in a remarkable direction. It was a small dromaeosaurid dinosaur, close to the line of birds but not itself a modern bird, with long feathers on its arms and legs. These hindlimb feathers gave it a four-winged appearance, forcing scientists to rethink how some close bird relatives moved through air. It may have glided from trees. It may have used aerodynamic surfaces during leaps or controlled descents. Whatever the exact behavior, its body was built for interaction with air. Microraptor is not important because it gives one final answer to the origin of flight. It is important because it shows that near the origin of birds, there were multiple aerodynamic experiments. Feathers on arms, feathers on legs, long tails, asymmetrical veins, climbing feet, grasping hands, and lightweight bodies could combine in ways no living animal exactly repeats. Evolution was not testing one design. It was working through several, and most of them left no descendants. Picture Microraptor high in a conifer. It is small enough that the branch holds it easily. Its claws grip bark. Its head turns toward movement below. The body is dark, perhaps iridescent in life if color reconstructions are correct for some specimens. When it launches, the limbs open, and for a moment, the animal is neither running nor flying in the modern bird sense. It is crossing space by a method that belonged to its own anatomy. What did Microraptor eat? Fossils and associated evidence suggest a varied diet that could include small vertebrates, birds, fish, or other prey, depending on specimen and interpretation. That flexibility fits a small predator in a rich lakeside ecosystem. The animal did not need to be a specialized aerial hunter in the way a modern falcon is. It could move through trees, ground, and shore margins, taking opportunities where they appeared. The famous sickle claw of dromaeosaurs must also be understood without exaggeration. It was a real weapon or gripping tool, but its exact use remains debated across different species. In a small animal such as Microraptor, it may have helped pin prey, climb, grasp, or stabilize the body during struggles. The fossil tells us the claw was there. Behavior must be reconstructed by comparing anatomy, wear, biomechanics, and living analogs, always with caution. Sinornithosaurus, another Jehol dromaeosaurid, brings the predator's body closer to the ground. It was feathered, lightly built, and armed with teeth and claws, suited to a small carnivorous life. For years, it has been discussed in debates about feeding and possible venom, though venom interpretations remain controversial. Even without dramatic additions, the animal is striking enough. A feathered raptor moving through a forest of older plants, hunting in the same world where early birds perched above it. Dromaeosaurs matter because they are close to birds within the wider theropod tree. Their wrists, shoulders, feathers, and limb proportions help scientists reconstruct the sequence by which the avian body plan emerged. Jehol did not provide every step, but it supplied many of the best preserved examples. It showed that bird-like traits were not confined to birds. They were scattered among close relatives, used for different purposes before some of them became integrated into avian flight. This makes the forest feel layered. A bird is not alone in the trees with feathers. A non-avian dinosaur also has them. A predator below may be more bird-like in its covering than a person once imagined. A bird above may be more dinosaurian in its claws and tail than a person once expected. The categories remain useful, but the living scene is more complicated than the labels. The question of how flight evolved has long moved between two broad ideas. One emphasizes ground-up origins, with running animals using feathered arms for balance, leaping, prey capture, or assisted climbing. The other emphasizes tree-down origins, with climbing animals gliding before developing powered flight. Jehol does not end that discussion, but it enriches it. A four-winged glider, early birds with varied flight abilities, and feathered ground dwellers all show that the transition involved several ecological settings. Modern debates do not usually ask whether birds are dinosaurs. That conclusion is strongly supported. The harder questions involve how specific features evolved, how they functioned at each stage, and how different lineages relate to one another. Fossils from Jehol and nearby deposits have sometimes shifted phylogenetic trees when new specimens were described. This is normal. Science revises because the rocks keep adding information, and each new skeleton can change the arrangement of branches. On a table in a museum or laboratory, these questions become smaller and more physical. A slab is lit from the side. A researcher leans close. The feather impressions are not bright. They are dark, faint, sometimes confusing. A bone disappears under mineral film and reappears as the light changes. The work is slow because the animal is not an illustration. It is a damaged archive, and every conclusion has to be earned. Jehol fossils also changed paleoart. Once feathered dinosaurs were no longer speculative outliers, artists had to rebuild the dinosaur age in color, texture, and posture. The change was not cosmetic. A feathered body carries itself differently. It handles cold differently. It displays differently. Its silhouette changes against plants and water. A scaly raptor and a feathered raptor are not the same animal in the viewer's mind. even if the skeleton underneath is similar. Paleoart matters because most people meet extinct animals through images before they meet them through papers. For decades, images trained the public to separate dinosaurs from birds. Jehol helped retrain that imagination. The small theropod became warmer, lighter, and more active. The bird became more ancient and stranger. The boundary became a gradient. A museum hall filled with feathered dinosaurs is not a trend, it is a correction. The correction also reaches the largest cultural misunderstanding about dinosaurs, that they are gone. Non-avian dinosaurs went extinct at the end of the Cretaceous, but birds survived. Every living bird is a dinosaur, part of the theropod lineage. Jehol's fossils do not merely connect dinosaurs to birds as distant cousins. They show the transition in bodies close enough to touch, where feathers, claws, teeth, tails, and wings appear in combinations that make the continuity visible. A sparrow outside a window does not look like Sinosauropteryx. It does not look like Microraptor. It has passed through more than 120 million years of additional evolution. But its feathers, skeleton, breathing system, eggs, and ancestry belong to the same deep history. Jehol makes that history less abstract. It gives the sparrow a fossil family album, filled with strange relatives preserved beside ancient lakes. Yet the story of Jehol is not only about ancestry, it is also about extinction. Most of the animals in those rocks left no living descendants. Confucius ornithids vanished. Enantiornithines vanished at the end of the Cretaceous. Non-avian feathered theropods vanished. Many fishes, insects, mammals, reptiles, and plants from the region represent branches that ended or transformed beyond recognition. The fossil bed is rich because life was rich, but richness is not permanence. The lake keeps them anyway. It keeps a bird with wings open. It keeps a fish with the curve of its spine. It keeps a dinosaur with a halo of feathers that looks like smoke around the skeleton. It keeps small deaths from a world that had no reason to expect us. The animals did not become fossils for a future museum. They died, settled, were covered, and waited under stone. The Jehol Biota also provides rare information about growth. Juvenile and adult specimens of certain animals allow paleontologists to study how proportions changed through life. In dinosaurs and birds, growth can be rapid, complex, and uneven across body regions. A young animal may not simply be a smaller adult. Its head, limbs, feathers, and ecological role may differ. If enough individuals are preserved, the rock can hold a population rather than a single anatomical point. Growth matters for classification because juveniles can look different enough to be mistaken for separate species. It also matters for ecology because young animals often eat different foods, face different predators, and use different habitats from adults. A young Psittacosaurus is not the same ecological object as a mature one. A juvenile bird may not fly like an adult. Jehol's abundance helps scientists ask these questions with more evidence than many fossil sites can offer. Nests, eggs, and reproductive traces are less common than bones, but the wider Jehol record includes evidence connected to reproduction in several groups. Pterosaurs, birds, amphibians, and other animals from these deposits have helped scientists think about breeding, development, and life cycles in the early Cretaceous. Reproduction is where evolution becomes immediate. It is not only who survives, but who grows, who reaches maturity, and whose body plan passes forward. For birds, reproduction connects especially to feathers. Feathers insulate eggs and chicks. They cover brooding adults. They display maturity. In non-avian dinosaurs, feathers may have served some of the same roles. A feathered theropod curled over a nest is not fantasy. Related evidence from other deposits and lineages supports brooding behaviors in some dinosaurs. Jehol adds the soft covering that makes such behaviors physically vivid. A nest is one of the most intimate anchors in deep time. It is not a skull with teeth or a claw built for killing. It is a place where an animal remained still, where heat mattered, where eggshell touched sediment, where danger approached from every side. Whether in Jehol or beyond it, The image of feathered dinosaurs near eggs brings the bird connection into behavior, not just anatomy. Pterosaurs also lived in the Jehol world. They were not dinosaurs, but close relatives within the larger Archosaur branch, and they were the first vertebrates to achieve powered flight. Jehol pterosaurs help fill the sky above the lakes. Some had teeth, some had crests, some were small and delicate. Their wing membranes, when preserved, remind us that Mesozoic air was shared by two very different flying lineages, pterosaurs and birds. Above a Jehol lake, a pterosaur could move in a way no bird exactly does. Its wing was a membrane stretched along an elongated fourth finger, supported by muscle, skin, fibers, and blood vessels rather than feathers. The body was light. The bones were hollow. The launch, flight, and landing mechanics belonged to a different evolutionary solution. Where a bird folded feathers, a pterosaur folded a living sail. Jehol pterosaurs are important because they preserve a range of forms within a region where birds were also diversifying. This allows scientists to ask how two flying vertebrate groups divided the air. Some pterosaurs may have fed near water, taking fish or insects. Others may have used shorelines, forests, or open spaces. Birds were not simply replacing them yet. For much of the Cretaceous, both groups thrived, shaped by different anatomies and different ecological opportunities. Competition between birds and pterosaurs should not be imagined as a single contest with one winner. Ecosystems are not tournaments. Different species can share broad habitats while using different foods, flight styles, nesting places, and daily schedules. A small bird taking insects from branches does not necessarily compete directly with a pterosaur fishing over open water. Jehol gives us the animals, but the exact boundaries of their niches must be inferred cautiously. At the edge of the lake, the sky is not empty. A pterosaur passes over water with a long winged steadiness. A bird lifts from a branch with quicker wing beats. Insects flicker between them. Below the surface, fish track shadows as sudden changes of light. The air above Jehol is layered with movement, and each movement belongs to a body plan tested by millions of years of evolution. Amphibians were also part of the Jehol world. Frogs and salamanders are preserved in some deposits, linking the lake's, wetlands, and forest floor. These animals are sensitive to water conditions, temperature, and habitat structure, so their fossils help reconstruct the environmental setting. They also mattered as prey. A small theropod, bird, mammal, snake, or larger amphibian could take them. In return, they consumed insects and other small animals, keeping energy moving through the lower levels of the food web. Salamanders in a Jehol stream or lake margin would have lived close to the skin of the environment. Moisture mattered. Shade mattered. Seasonal drying mattered. Their bodies were not built for long journeys across open, dry ground. They occupied the damp seams of the landscape, under plants, near water, and along soft banks. When preserved, they remind us that dinosaur ecosystems were also amphibian ecosystems, insect ecosystems, plant ecosystems, and microbial ecosystems. Choristoderes, aquatic or semi-aquatic reptiles that superficially resemble crocodile-like forms in some cases, also lived in the region. They belonged to an extinct group that survived for a long span of the Mesozoic and into the Cenozoic in some places. In Jehol, they add another predatory presence to the water's edge. They were not dinosaurs, not crocodilians, and not lizards, but another branch of reptile life that once seemed secure and is now entirely gone. Turtles appear as well, and their presence is useful because turtles often live in exactly the kinds of freshwater environments Jehol preserved. Shells fossilize well compared with many other body parts, but in exceptional deposits, even more complete preservation is possible. A turtle in the lake is an anchor of continuity. Its body plan is ancient and recognizable, yet the species and ecosystem around it are deeply extinct. A turtle surfacing near the shore would make almost no sound. The head rises, the nostrils meet air, and the shell sits for a moment among reflected branches. Above it, a bird calls or moves. Somewhere behind the bank, a feathered theropod steps through dry leaves. These ordinary separations of habitat, water, bank, trunk, branch, are where the Jehol world becomes most convincing. Mammals in Jehol are especially important because they show that Mesozoic mammals were more diverse than the old stereotype allowed. Some were small insectivores, some were gliders or climbers, some were burrowers. Repenomamus was large enough to eat small vertebrates. Other forms, such as Eomaya and Cynodelphis, have been discussed in relation to early placental and marsupial relatives, though the exact placement of early mammals often remains technical and debated. The mammal record from Jehol does not mean that modern mammal groups had already taken over. They had not. Dinosaurs still held the large terrestrial roles, but mammals were not simply waiting in a uniform shadow. They were evolving teeth, limbs, hearing structures, reproductive strategies, and ecological habits. Jehol shows them as active participants in the ecosystem, not as footnotes below the dinosaurs. A small mammal moving at night would experience Jehol differently from a daytime dinosaur. Scent would matter. Vibrations would matter. The thin sounds of insects, the damp smell of lake mud, the warmth retained in a burrow, the danger of a small theropod or snake, all of these would shape its world. The forest at night was not empty because the dinosaurs were less visible. It belonged to another shift of animals. Night is one of the great missing pieces in paleoart. We often imagine extinct ecosystems under sunlight because daylight makes bodies easier to see. But half of every ancient day was dark. In Jehol, feathered dinosaurs slept or hunted. Mammals foraged. Amphibians moved. Insects called or emerged. The lake cooled. Ash, if it fell into darkness as easily as into noon. The fossil record preserves bodies, but the day-night cycle preserves behavior only through inference. Burrowing is another hidden behavior. Some Jehol mammals and other animals may have used underground shelters, and burrows elsewhere in the fossil record show how important subterranean life can be. A burrow protects against cold, heat, predators, and sudden environmental stress. In a volcanic landscape, however, shelter could become a trap if gases, ash, flooding, or rapid sediment entered the system. Survival strategies can reverse under extreme conditions. This reversal is part of what makes Jehol preservation so complex. A forested lake basin can be productive and dangerous at the same time. The same fine ash that creates fertile soils can suffocate or poison. The same lake that sustains fish can become an oxygen-poor trap. The same still bottom that preserves feathers begins as a place where life cannot easily disturb the dead. Jehol is not a paradise. It is a functioning world with hazards. Scientific work on Jehol taphonomy has proposed multiple preservation mechanisms, including rapid burial in lake sediments and volcanic processes that may have killed or transported animals. Some studies have argued for pyroclastic flows or volcanic ash-related events in certain horizons. Others emphasize lake bottom chemistry, low oxygen, fine lamination, and repeated sedimentation. The safest interpretation is plural. Different fossils in different layers may have followed different paths into stone. This matters because preservation mechanisms affect how we read the ecosystem. If many animals died in sudden events, then a fossil layer may not represent the normal living community at one quiet moment. It may represent a disaster sample. If bodies were transported, then animals found together may not have lived together at exactly that place. If lake conditions selected for some organisms over others, abundance in the rock may not equal abundance in life. A fossil is always both an animal and an event. It is the animal that lived, and it is the circumstance that preserved it. To understand Jehol, scientists have to study anatomy, sediment, chemistry, volcanic layers, mineral replacement, and the position of bones. The feathered dinosaur draws the eye, but the mud around it tells part of the story. The rock is not a frame, it is evidence. The thin layers of Jehol sediment can resemble pages in a book, but they were formed by physical processes, not by a narrator. Seasonal changes may have added laminae. Ash falls may have created distinct horizons. Floods may have carried material into basins. Quiet intervals may have allowed fine particles to settle slowly. Over time, layer upon layer built the archive. Later uplift, erosion, quarrying, and splitting exposed it again. Time compressed the lakes into stone, and human hands opened the stone along plains that had once been lake bottoms. That is why so many Jehol fossils appear flattened, as if the animal has been gently pressed. The flattening is geological, but the preservation can still be exquisite. A body loses depth and keeps outline. A wing loses motion and keeps feathers. A fish loses water and keeps scales. The famous Liaoning slabs also carry a history of collection, trade, preparation, and scientific authentication. Exceptional fossils can become valuable, and value can lead to problems, including illegal collecting, composite specimens, or loss of contextual data. For paleontology, where a fossil is found and exactly which layer it comes from can be as important as the fossil itself. Jehol's scientific power depends on preserving that context. Some specimens from the broader Chinese fossil trade have required careful study to confirm authenticity, association, or provenance. This does not diminish Jehol's importance. It is part of working with spectacular fossils in a real human world. Scientists rely on detailed preparation, imaging, sedimentological data, and comparisons with securely collected material. A fossil without context can still be beautiful, but it may answer fewer questions. The best specimens are not only beautiful, they are located in time and place. A layer, a quarry, a formation, a relationship to ash beds above and below, a position within a sequence of lake deposits. These details make the difference between an isolated wonder and a piece of Earth history. The animal matters, but so does the bed that held it. Jehol also forces us to think about scale. A viewer may begin with one feather, one famous dinosaur, one bird with a long tail. But the real story extends from microscopic pigment structures to regional tectonics. It includes the diameter of a melanosome, the length of a wing feather, the depth of a lake, the height of a conifer, the winter temperature of a basin, and the volcanic history of northeastern Asia. This range of scale is normal in paleontology. To explain why a feather is preserved, one may need mineral chemistry. To explain why the animal had feathers, one may need physiology and climate. To explain why those species lived there, one may need plants, prey, predators, and geography. Jehol is powerful because it connects these scales so clearly. A tiny structure on a slab can lead outward to the whole landscape. The volcanoes must always remain in the background, not as constant eruptions, not as a simple catastrophe that defines every day, but as a geological pressure in the region. Ash beds record their presence. Volcanic influence shaped soils, lakes, and preservation. Animals lived under the possibility of sudden environmental change. The Jehol world was green, active, and diverse, but it was built on unstable ground. A morning could begin with feeding and end with ash in the air. The sky could dim. Fine particles could settle on leaves, water, feathers, and eyes. Fish might rise or sink as the chemistry changed. Animals near the ground might flee, hide, cough, or simply fail to understand the danger. There is no need to exaggerate the scene. Volcanic landscapes are frightening enough when described plainly. Some deaths may have been sudden enough to preserve animals in lifelike postures. Others may have been ordinary deaths, caught by unusual sediment. The distinction is not always easy, and the temptation to make every fossil a disaster victim should be resisted. Still, the presence of volcanism gives Jehol attention that is different from many fossil sites. Life did not merely happen beside lakes. It happened beside lakes in a restless volcanic province. The fossiliferous formations, especially Yixian and Jufotang, were not deposited all at once. They represent time, change, and different habitats. The Yixian is often associated with some of the most famous feathered dinosaurs, while the Jufotang has yielded many birds and other animals as well. The Huajing Formation is often discussed as an older part of the broader Jehol story under certain definitions. Scientific definitions vary, but the core idea remains volcanic-influenced early Cretaceous ecosystems of northeastern China preserved in lake and related sediments. Dates matter because Jehol sits after Archaeopteryx, but before the end Cretaceous extinction by more than 50 million years. It is neither the beginning nor the end of bird evolution. It is a flourishing middle chapter where early birds had diversified and non-avian feathered dinosaurs still shared the land and trees with them. That placement makes it ideal for studying how avian traits spread, changed, and became ecologically useful. The easiest to enter through the animals, but it was held together by plants. Conifer needles, ginkgo leaves, fern fronds, cycad crowns, and Benedictilian structures formed the edible world through which every herbivore moved. A beak did not encounter vegetation as a category. It met specific textures: tough, waxy, fibrous, soft, young, old, bitter, resinous, damp, dusty with ash, or newly washed by rain. Plant communities also controlled visibility. A small predator hunting in open, fern-covered ground used different tactics from one moving through dense understory. A bird perched in a conifer could see the water, but might be hidden from an animal below. A Psittacosaurus feeding near a thicket could vanish quickly if startled. When we reconstruct Jehol, the plants are not scenery behind the dinosaurs. They are the structure that makes behavior possible. The absence of grass in the modern sense matters. No grazing lawns stretched along the water. Low vegetation was made of ferns, horsetails, young shoots, seedlings, and other plants whose growth forms differed from later grasslands. A herbivore, feeding low to the ground, cropped a different world from a deer or cow. Its teeth, beak, jaw muscles, and gut answered to plants that belonged to the early Cretaceous, not to a modern meadow. Psittacosaurus had a beak well suited for nipping vegetation, and its cheek region and tooth batteries were not like those of the later horned dinosaurs, but they were effective for its own time. It was common in many deposits, suggesting ecological success. Common animals are often less spectacular than rare giants, but they are more important to understanding a food web. They are the repeated meals, the repeated tracks, the repeated bodies that predators, scavengers, and landscapes must accommodate. A herd or loose group of Psittacosaurus moving toward water would make a low pattern through plants. Juveniles stay close. Adults pause, crop, look up, and move again. Their beaks click through stems. Their feet disturb insects. The shoreline holds smells of mud, fish, and decay. Somewhere nearby, a mammal may shelter in a burrow, and a small theropod waits for movement small enough to risk chasing. Social behavior in Psittacosaurus and other Jehol animals must be reconstructed cautiously. Multiple individuals preserved together may reflect living groups, parental associations, or sudden death assemblages. Fossil position alone can mislead. Still, repeated finds, growth stages, and comparisons with living animals allow careful inferences. Dinosaur social life was real, but its exact form varied. Some species may have grouped often. Others may have gathered only around water, nesting areas, or seasonal resources. The young were always vulnerable. A juvenile dinosaur represents a concentration of future possibility and present danger. It is smaller, less experienced, easier to overpower, and more likely to die before leaving offspring. The Jehol fossil of Reptinomammus with juvenile Psittacosaurus remains gives a rare direct view of this vulnerability. A mammal could take advantage. So could small theropods, larger birds, snakes, choristideres near water, or any opportunist with the right size and timing. Most predation leaves no fossil. A bite that kills a small animal may scatter bones or leave none at all. A swallowed body is usually erased completely. The Reptinomammus specimen matters because it caught a private event in public evidence. It takes a moment that would normally vanish inside digestion and holds it still long enough for us to recognize the relationship between predator, prey, and place. Food webs are built from these ordinary transactions. Plants become herbivore tissue. Herbivores become carnivore tissue. Insects move plant energy into the bodies of birds, amphibians, mammals, and small dinosaurs. Fish move lake productivity into larger aquatic and shoreline predators. Scavengers recycle bodies. Bacteria and fungi complete the process. The dramatic animals attract attention, but the system depends on countless smaller transfers of energy. Sinosauropteryx likely occupied one of those smaller predatory roles. It was not an apex predator. It was a small theropod in a landscape of insects, lizards, small mammals, young dinosaurs, and other manageable prey. Its long tail balanced the body. Its filamentous covering softened the outline. Its head and jaws were suited to quick feeding opportunities. In many ways, it was more like a fox-sized hunter than a monster. The body of Sinosauropteryx is important because it helped separate feathers from flight in the public mind. Simple filaments along a grounded little theropod are difficult to explain as flight structures. They make much more sense as insulation, display, or some combination of functions. That recognition allowed scientists and viewers to stop treating feathers as an exclusively aerial technology and start seeing them as part of dinosaur skin biology. The filaments of Sinosauropteryx are not identical to the complex flight feathers of modern birds. This distinction is essential. Feather evolution involved stages, and not all feather-like structures had the same form or function. Some early filaments may have been simple hollow tubes, others branched, others developed veins. The Jehol record preserves several points in this diversity, but it does not compress them into a single universal feather type. Still, the emotional effect of that first recognition is hard to overstate. A little dinosaur, once expected to be scaly, appears with a fuzzy outline. It becomes warmer in the mind, smaller, quicker, more vulnerable, more alive. The change is not sentimental, it comes from evidence. But evidence can still alter feeling when it gives an extinct animal back part of its surface. Caudipteryx pushed the issue further because its feathers were more elaborate. The arm and tail feathers were large enough to be visually obvious, but the animal's anatomy suggests it was not built for sustained powered flight. It likely lived as a ground-based animal, perhaps omnivorous, moving through vegetation and using its feathered limbs and tail for display, balance, brooding, or other non-flight functions. The body was a reminder that feathers can be impressive without being wings. Display is an underrated force in evolution because it leaves a strange signature. Structures become exaggerated not because they help an animal eat or run, but because they affect how other animals respond. A tail fan, a crest, a feather pattern, or a pair of long plumes can alter mating success, rivalry, recognition, or intimidation. Jehol's feathered dinosaurs may have lived in a world full of signals we can barely reconstruct. Some signals may have involved color. Fossil melanosomes, when preserved and interpreted with care, can suggest dark, reddish, gray, iridescent, or patterned areas in certain feathered dinosaurs and birds. This does not mean we can paint every Jehol animal with certainty, but the possibility of pattern changes the ecosystem. A feathered dinosaur is no longer only warm, it may also be striped, banded, shaded, glossy, or marked for display. A banded tail moving through ferns would catch the eye. To a predator, it might confuse motion or break the outline. To a mate, it might identify species or condition. To a rival, it might signal size, maturity, or confidence. The same pattern could serve several functions at once. In life, color is rarely just decoration. It is information moving across distance. The study of fossil color is still young compared with the study of bones, and it must remain conservative. Mineral films, bacterial traces, and preservation artifacts can complicate interpretation, but Jehol provided the kind of preservation that made the question possible. That alone is extraordinary. Most dinosaur sites cannot preserve the evidence needed even to begin the conversation. Jehol can sometimes bring the surface of the animal close enough for microscopic investigation. Jehol also shows how dangerous it is to reconstruct extinct animals from incomplete expectations. For much of modern paleontological history, dinosaurs were restored according to the evidence available at the time, but also according to cultural assumptions about reptiles, heat, activity, and skin. When new fossils showed feathers, the old restorations did not simply need a few additions. In some cases, the entire visual grammar of dinosaurs had to change. The change continues. Not every dinosaur was feathered. Many lineages retained scales over large parts of the body, and skin impressions from some groups show scaly surfaces. Large sauropods and many ornithischians probably did not look like birds. But among theropods, especially coelurosaurs, feathers or feather-like structures were widespread enough that any reconstruction must take them seriously. The accurate dinosaur world is not all feathers and not all scales. It is a mixed world. Jehol's ornithischians, such as Psittacosaurus, remind us that feather discussions should not erase other dinosaur groups. Ceratopsians, ankylosaur relatives, and other herbivorous dinosaurs had their own skin structures, body coverings, and display features. The Jehol story is centered on feathers because the feathered fossils are so transformative, but the ecosystem itself was not a feather museum. It was a community of many body types. A viewer standing in that forest would notice difference before classification. A beaked herbivore pushing through stems. A shaggy predator in shade. A small bird perched above water. A pterosaur passing overhead. A mammal disappearing into a hole. A turtle in the shallows. The names would come later. The first impression would be movement, texture, and the realization that the Mesozoic was not one kind of animal repeated at different sizes. The ancient lakes tied those differences together. Water attracted animals that might otherwise use separate parts of the landscape. Fish lived there full-time. Insects emerged there. Birds hunted over it. Dinosaurs drank at its edge. Amphibians bred near it. Volcanic ash settled into it. The lake was habitat, resource, hazard, and archive. Without the lakes, the Jehol Biota as we know it would not exist. Lake deposits can preserve time at a fine scale, but they also distort. A shoreline assemblage may overrepresent animals drawn to water. A deep water layer may preserve fish better than terrestrial animals. A volcanic ash event may gather bodies from several habitats. To reconstruct the living ecosystem, paleontologists must separate the biology from the taphonomic filter. The fossils are evidence, but they are evidence shaped by the conditions of burial. Even the position of a skeleton can be complicated. A curled posture might indicate resting, suffocation, transport, muscle contraction after death, or collapse during decay. A spread wing might record death position or post-mortem movement. A body aligned with others might suggest current direction, not behavior. Jehol fossils often look wonderfully complete, but completeness does not remove the need for caution. The stone preserves, it does not explain itself. Still, there are moments when interpretation can rest on something solid. A fish inside a bird, a juvenile dinosaur inside a mammal, feathers attached to a limb, a body outline around a skeleton. These are not guesses in the same way as a reconstructed call or mating dance. They are physical associations. They do not tell the whole story, but they place a handrail across the distance. That handrail is why Jehol has become one of the great fossil windows of the world. It does not show every dinosaur. It does not show every stage of bird evolution. It does not preserve a complete planet. But it captures a landscape at the exact level of detail needed to change large questions. It shows that the age of dinosaurs was also an age of feathers, birds, mammals, lakes, volcanic ash, and ecological experiments. The more closely we look, the less simple the world becomes. Predators may be feathered. Birds may have claws. Mammals may eat dinosaurs. Dinosaurs may use feathers without flying. Lakes may preserve forests. Volcanoes may kill and create. The old categories remain useful for textbooks, but the living Jehol world was not organized around our categories. It was organized around survival. Survival in Jehol meant responding to season, temperature, food, rivals, predators, disease, and sudden environmental stress. It meant finding enough energy to grow, molt, display, reproduce, and avoid becoming another animal's meal. It meant using feathers, beaks, teeth, claws, shells, wings, burrows, swimming bodies, and flight membranes. The fossil record freezes bodies, but behind every body was a sequence of decisions and pressures that played out moment by moment. One way to understand Jehol is to follow a single day around the lake. Before sunrise, the water is darker than the trees around it, and the deeper part of the basin holds the night's cold. Small mammals retreat towards shelter after feeding in the dim hours. Amphibians settle back into wet cover. Insects cling to stems beaded with moisture. A small feathered theropod, already warm enough to move, works through the edge of the vegetation, stopping whenever a sound cuts through the stillness. Nothing in this moment is arranged for discovery. It is only a morning. As light grows, birds become easier to see. A Confuciusornis shifts on a branch, balancing with wing claws and feet, then drops into the air with short wing beats. Another bird moves lower, closer to the water, searching for insects or small fish at the surface. Their flight is not identical to that of modern birds. Some motions may be less efficient, some more labored, some specialized in ways that left no surviving equivalent. But the basic transformation has already happened. A dinosaur lineage is using feathers to travel through air. The presence of birds in Jehol should not make the non-avian dinosaurs feel outdated or failed. They were flourishing beside them. Sinosauropteryx, Microraptor, Caudipteryx, Beipiausaurus, Dilong, Eutyrannus, and other forms represent different branches of theropod life. Not a single line waiting to become birds. Some used feathers for insulation. Some carried display feathers. Some interacted with air. Some were predators. Some likely omnivores or herbivores. The feathered dinosaur world was broad enough to contain several lifestyles at once. This is why the term missing link can be misleading. Jehol does not provide one perfect animal halfway between dinosaur and bird. It provides a community of related animals with different combinations of traits. Evolutionary transitions look like this when the fossil record is good enough. Not a chain, but a thicket. Some branches angle toward living birds. Others end. Others run parallel for a time. The value of Jehol is that it lets us see the thicket instead of imagining a straight path. By mid-morning, the shore becomes busier. A Psittacosaurus feeds in low vegetation, using its beak with a steady, practical rhythm. A turtle surfaces and disappears. Fish turn beneath insect shadows. A pterosaur crosses the lake, its membrane wing held in a shape no bird could copy. The animals are not posing together, but their lives overlap because water gathers them. A lake edge is one of the best places for an ecosystem to reveal itself, even if the revelation comes only after burial. The Jehol Biota is sometimes summarized through its spectacular fossils, but its everyday ecology is just as important. Herbivores shaped plant growth by feeding. Predators influenced where and how prey moved. Scavengers and decomposers broke down bodies. Aquatic animals linked the water column to shorelines and flying predators. Seasonal stress may have forced animals to concentrate around remaining resources. These relationships are difficult to reconstruct, yet the breadth of Jehol fossils allows scientists to approach the ecosystem as a connected web rather than a list. A volcanic event interrupts such a day without warning. It may begin far from the lake as an eruption column, ash cloud, or surge of hot material moving across a slope. It may arrive as falling particles that coat leaves and water. It may change air quality before an animal sees any obvious danger. Some deaths in Jehol may have been related to these events, though not every fossil should be forced into a volcanic catastrophe. The important point is that volcanism was part of the setting in which life unfolded. Ash on feathers is easy to imagine because it behaves like a second skin. It settles along filaments, catches in veins, powders the head and back, and turns breathing into effort. On the lake, it breaks the surface into tiny impacts, then sinks. In the forest, it dulls leaves. Animals that survive move through a changed landscape, while animals that do not may be carried, buried, or left where sediment can reach them quickly enough to preserve what usually disappears. Rapid burial is central to many exceptional fossils, but rapid does not always mean violent in the same way. A body might be covered quickly by ash-rich sediment after transport into a lake. It might settle through water and lie on an anoxic bottom. It might be entombed by fine material before scavengers arrive. The details vary, and paleontologists use sedimentary structures, mineralogy, posture, tissue preservation, and layer relationships to distinguish among possibilities. Jehol is a taphonomic laboratory as much as a biological one. The phrase Pompeii-like has sometimes been used for fossil deposits associated with sudden burial, but it should be handled with care. Jehol was not a single city buried in one eruption. It was a long-lived series of environments with repeated depositional events across millions of years. Some horizons may record mass mortality, others may reflect quieter accumulation. The drama of the fossils should not flatten the geological complexity that made them possible. Afternoon over the lake would bring warmth to the surface, insects into motion, and sharper shadows under branches. A small bird might preen, drawing its beak through feathers that were not preserved for beauty, but for function. A feather out of place matters to a flying animal. It changes airflow, insulation, waterproofing, and display. The act of preening, so familiar in living birds, almost certainly has deep roots in the care required by complex plumage. Did non-avian feathered dinosaurs preen in similar ways? Direct evidence is difficult, but feathers require maintenance. Living birds use beaks, feet, oils, and repeated motions to keep plumage functional. A feathered dinosaur with display or insulating structures would also need to manage wear, dirt, parasites, and seasonal replacement. The fossils do not preserve the gesture, but the biology of feathers makes some kind of maintenance likely. Molting is another hidden part of the story. Feathers are not permanent. They grow, wear, break, and are replaced. In living birds, molt can be tied to season, breeding, migration, and age. In feathered non-avian dinosaurs, molt patterns are harder to reconstruct, but the need for replacement would have existed. A Jehol feather preserved alone in sediment may represent death, but it may also represent ordinary shedding from an animal that flew or walked away. A single fallen feather can be less tragic than a skeleton. It may have drifted from a living animal, settled on water, soaked through, and sunk. No death is required. The fossil feather that opens the imagination might not be a last trace of a dying body, but a lost part of a living one. That possibility gives the stone a different kind of intimacy. Not every fossil is a tomb. Some are discarded surfaces. The lake also received leaves, pollen, spores, branches, and seeds. These plant remains help reconstruct the surrounding vegetation and climate. A dinosaur skeleton may dominate a display case, but a leaf impression can tell us what kind of shade fell over that dinosaur, what food was available, how seasons changed, and what kind of forest bordered the water. Jehol's plants are quieter fossils, but they are foundational. Early angiosperms, or flowering plants, appear in the broader Early Cretaceous world, and the Jehol record has contributed to discussions about their early diversification. They were not yet the overwhelming dominant plants they would become later, but their emergence was one of the great transformations of the Cretaceous. Flowering plants would eventually reshape insect evolution, herbivore diets, forest structure, and the future of terrestrial ecosystems. In Jehol, they appear near the beginning of that larger botanical change. The exact identity and significance of some early flowering plant fossils can be debated, and paleobotany is a careful field where small structures matter. It would be wrong to imagine Jehol as a modern flowering forest. The older gymnosperm-dominated world remains strong. But the presence of early angiosperm evidence places Jehol near another transition. Not only feathered dinosaurs and early birds, but also the early spread of plant lineages that would later define much of the living world. This means Jehol stands at several crossroads at once. Feathers are diversifying, birds are radiating, mammals are experimenting in the shadows, flowering plants are beginning to matter. Pterosaurs still own much of the sky. Non-avian dinosaurs remain powerful and varied. Volcanic landscapes preserve what they sometimes destroy. Few fossil regions capture so many transitions in one place with such physical detail. But crossroads are not peaceful by definition. They are places where lineages meet, compete, and disappear. Early birds diversified, but many avian branches ended. Feathered dinosaurs flourished, but non-avian forms would ultimately vanish. Flowering plants rose, and older plant communities shifted. Mammals survived, but most Mesozoic mammal lineages did not lead directly to familiar modern forms. Jehol is not a promise of success. It is a record of experimentation under pressure. Evening returns the lake to reflection. The branches darken first, then the shore, then the water. Flying animals settle. Nocturnal ones begin to move. A small mammal tests the entrance of a burrow. A dinosaur folds its limbs beneath it. A bird tucks its head. The day has passed without becoming a fossil. Most days did. The record we have is made from the few moments when ordinary time was interrupted or unusually preserved. Some Jehol fossils preserve sleeping or resting postures that resemble those of living birds, especially among small theropods from related deposits in northeastern China. These postures, with limbs folded and head tucked, support the view that bird-like behaviors were present among non-avian theropods. Even when a specific specimen falls just outside the strictest Jehol definition, the regional record reinforces the same broader theme: anatomy and behavior were changing together. It is important not to blend every famous Chinese feathered dinosaur into Jehol without distinction. Some come from other formations or slightly different times, such as the Jurassic Chaojishan Formation. Anchiornis, for example, is highly relevant to feather and bird origin discussions, but it is not usually treated as a core Jehol animal. Keeping these distinctions clear preserves the integrity of the story. Jehol is rich enough without borrowing carelessly. This restraint actually makes Jehol more impressive. Even when neighboring deposits are set aside, the Jehol Biota contains enough feathered dinosaurs, early birds, mammals, pterosaurs, plants, fishes, insects, and lake organisms to stand as one of the great fossil ecosystems in the world. It does not need every spectacular Chinese fossil to be placed inside it. Its own record is dense, coherent, and transformative. Definitions of Jehol have varied historically. Some definitions focused on classic lake fossils such as particular fish, insects, and clam shrimp. Others expanded the term across broader regions and equivalent deposits. More recent work has emphasized organisms living in early Cretaceous volcanic-influenced environments of northeastern China, buried mainly in lake sediments and sometimes fluvial settings, with exceptional preservation. That definition anchors the biota in ecology, geography, time, and taphonomy. For a voiceover, the definition may sound technical, but it matters because it keeps the world from becoming vague. Jehol is not simply any Chinese fossil with feathers. It is a particular early Cretaceous window in northeastern China, tied to volcanoes and lakes. Its power comes from that specificity. A feather in stone is more meaningful when we know the basin, the formation, the sediment, and the broader community that surrounded it. The human story enters later, with quarries, collectors, museums, laboratories, and papers. But the stone was already there, holding what it held. Workers split slabs because the rock had practical and commercial value. Scientists recognized patterns. Specimens moved into collections. Some were prepared under microscopes with delicate tools. A dark smear became a feather. A faint outline became a body covering. A small skeleton became a challenge to old assumptions. There is also a responsibility in that human story. Fossils removed without context lose part of their scientific voice. Fossils sold without documentation can be difficult to place precisely in time and space. Spectacular specimens can tempt exaggeration or forgery. Jehol's importance has made it vulnerable to these problems, and careful paleontology has to work not only with ancient evidence, but with the modern conditions under which that evidence is collected, prepared, and studied. Still, the best work returns to the animal. A prepared slab under light. A skull measured carefully. A feather photographed under magnification. A CT scan revealing hidden bone. A chemical test examining preserved structures. The methods become modern, but the object remains ancient, a body from a lake basin where dinosaurs, birds, mammals, and plants shared the same air more than 120 million years ago. The more we learn from Jehol, the more the word dinosaur changes shape. It expands from giants into small, feathered predators, beaked herbivores, sleeping postures, display feathers, brooding possibilities, gliding experiments, and bird ancestry. It does not shrink the grandeur of dinosaurs, it deepens it. A sauropod shaking a Jurassic floodplain and a Sinosauropteryx moving along a Cretaceous lakeshore are both part of the same vast evolutionary success. The dinosaur age is often divided in the public imagination into separate icons. The Jurassic has sauropods and stegosaurs. The late Cretaceous has tyrannosaurs and horned dinosaurs. Birds belong to the present. Jehol interrupts that separation. It sits in the early Cretaceous, but it carries Jurassic questions forward and points toward modern skies. It shows that the Mesozoic was not a series of clean museum rooms. It was a continuous transformation, with old lineages persisting, new ones appearing, and familiar traits emerging inside unfamiliar bodies. To see that clearly, return to the small theropod body. The bones are light, the tail long, the legs built for quick movement. The hands are still functional. The head is narrow. Around the skeleton, filaments form a border that changes everything. Without the halo, the animal might be restored as another little carnivorous dinosaur. With it, the body becomes part of the feather story, and the feather story becomes part of dinosaur biology rather than a special feature held aside for birds. Scientists distinguish between non-avian dinosaurs and birds for clarity, but the phrase non-avian dinosaur can sound clumsy because it is trying to preserve a truth that ordinary language often hides. Birds are dinosaurs, but most dinosaurs were not birds. Jehol lives inside that distinction. It contains birds, and it contains feathered dinosaurs outside the bird branch. The fossils force the language to become precise because the bodies themselves are precise in unexpected ways. A small feathered predator near a Jehol lake would not think of itself as transitional. It would respond to hunger, cold, threat, and opportunity. Its feathers might lift slightly in wind. Its feet might leave prints that dried and disappeared before noon. Its eyes might track a lizard through stems. It might flee from something larger. It might sleep with its head tucked close to the body. Evolutionary significance belongs to our view from the future, not to the animal's mourning. The Jehol fossils also helped shift discussions of dinosaur metabolism, feathers, growth rates, bone histology, posture, and the close relationship between theropods and birds all contribute to a view of many dinosaurs as active animals with elevated metabolisms compared with typical reptiles. This does not make every dinosaur identical to a modern bird, but it moves them away from the old image of slow, cold, swamp-bound reptiles. In Jehol especially, small insulated bodies fit an active ecological role. The lakeshore would have demanded activity. Insects do not wait. Small prey vanish into cover. Predators appear suddenly. Birds lift and land. Seasonal changes alter food availability. A sluggish animal in that setting would miss opportunities and become opportunity for others. The fossil record cannot measure every heartbeat, but the combination of feathers, anatomy, and ecological context points toward animals capable of quick responses and sustained lives in a variable environment. The Jehol Biota became famous partly because it arrived at the right scientific moment. Cladistic studies were already strengthening the dinosaur-bird connection. New preparation and imaging techniques were improving fossil interpretation. Paleontologists were increasingly willing to reconstruct dinosaurs as active, complex animals. Then, Liaoning fossils provided the soft tissue evidence that made the argument visible. Scientific ideas can exist for decades before a fossil gives them a face. That face is sometimes very small, a skull the length of a hand, a wing folded against the body, a tail feather no wider than a ribbon. The scale matters because it changes the emotional register of the Mesozoic. Not every revelation comes from a giant. Some arrive from animals small enough to fit on a slab, preserved so delicately that a misplaced tool could erase the evidence forever. The Jehol birds show several stages in the reduction of the tail. Archaeopteryx from the Jurassic had a long bony tail, and some Jehol birds such as Jeholornis retained that ancestral feature. Other birds had shortened tails, moving closer to the modern condition, where a pygostyle supports tail feathers. Tail reduction matters for flight because it changes balance, weight, and control. It also shows how the bird body became reorganized gradually through many anatomical shifts rather than one transformation. A long-tailed bird in flight would cast a different silhouette from a modern songbird. Its tail was not only feathers, but a chain of vertebrae extending behind the body. It may have helped with stability or display, but it also carried weight. Later birds shortened that bony structure and used feather fans for control. Jehol preserves both old and newer arrangements close enough in time to make the transformation visible. Teeth tell a similar story. Some Jehol birds had teeth, while others had toothless beaks. Tooth loss evolved more than once in different lineages, and beaks could serve many functions, from feeding to grooming to nest work. A toothless beak does not automatically mean a bird is modern, and teeth do not mean it is primitive in every respect. Traits move independently. Jehol's bird record is powerful because it shows those independent movements in actual bodies. A beak without teeth closing on a seed is a small thing. A toothed jaw catching a fish is another. Both can belong to early birds. Both can exist in the same broad ecosystem. The lake does not care whether one looks more familiar to us. It offers insects, fish, seeds, branches, mud, and danger. Each bird lineage takes what its anatomy allows and leaves the rest to others. Confuciusornis is especially useful because of the number of specimens known. Abundance allows questions that a single fossil cannot answer. Scientists can compare individuals, examine variation, study growth, consider sexual dimorphism, and ask whether long tail feathers occurred in one sex, one age group, or a more complex pattern. With enough fossils, paleontology begins to move from description toward population biology. Jehol's abundance makes that possible for certain animals. The long paired tail feathers of some Confuciusornis individuals are often restored as display structures, and that interpretation is plausible because such feathers would likely create drag in flight while offering visual impact. In living birds, extravagant feathers often come with costs. They can make flight harder, increase predation risk, or require energy to grow. Their persistence usually means they matter socially or reproductively. In Jehol, display may have been as important as survival in shaping feathers. Display brings sound into the imagination, even when sound itself is not preserved. Early birds may have called. Feathered dinosaurs may have used body postures, colors, and movements. Pterosaurs may have signaled with crests. Psittacosaurus may have communicated through posture or vocalization. The fossil record gives bones and feathers, but living animals are not silent diagrams. They interact constantly, and some of that interaction must have filled Jehol forests with signals we cannot directly recover. We should not invent specific calls or colors beyond evidence, but we can say that animals with eyes, ears, display structures, and social lives would have communicated. A forest without mammal songs or modern bird choruses may still have been noisy. Insects, amphibians, birds, pterosaurs, and dinosaurs could all contribute. The soundscape would be unfamiliar, but not empty. The Mesozoic was not silent simply because microphones were absent. At night, that soundscape would change. Day-flying birds settle. Insects take over certain frequencies. Amphibians call near water. Small mammals move through leaves. A distant splash opens and closes. Predators that use darkness begin their routes. The lake reflects stars that are familiar in physics but not in arrangement from the ground below, because the continents, climate, and life around them are different. Continental position matters. During the Early Cretaceous, East Asia was shaped by tectonic activity that created basins and volcanic provinces. The Jehol region was not an isolated stage set, but part of a wider Earth system. Plate movement influenced topography, drainage, volcanism, and climate. Those geological forces created the basins where lakes could persist and where sediments could accumulate. Without them, the feathered animals might have lived and died without exceptional preservation. This is one of paleontology's deep lessons. Discovery depends on geology as much as biology. An animal can be extraordinary, but if it dies in a place where bones rot, scatter, or erode, it vanishes. Another animal, no more important in life, dies in a basin with fine sediment and low oxygen and becomes a window into an era. The fossil record is not a ranking of ancient importance. It is the result of life meeting preservation. Jehol's animals were lucky only from our perspective. The individuals themselves were not lucky to die and be buried. The luck belongs to knowledge. It belongs to the fact that ash, mud, water, chemistry, burial, uplift, erosion, quarrying, and scientific attention aligned across more than 100 million years. That alignment lets a feather lie under a modern lamp and still hold the outline of an early Cretaceous morning. The fish Lycoptera, the clam shrimp, and the mayfly-like insects that formed classic components of older Jehol definitions remind us that the biota was recognized first through lake organisms, not only through dinosaurs. These small aquatic and semi-aquatic fossils helped define the region's fossil character before feathered dinosaurs made it globally famous. They remain essential because they show the environmental setting. Feathered dinosaurs became the headline, but lake life wrote the first lines. Fish fossils can preserve in large numbers because lakes occasionally produce mass mortality. Changes in oxygen, temperature, volcanic input, algal blooms, or water chemistry can kill many fish at once. Their bodies settle, align, overlap, or scatter depending on currents and decay. In Jehol, fish are not simply food for birds and reptiles. They are environmental indicators, recording the state of the water in which much of the preservation happened. A school of Lycoptera, moving below a thin layer of ash, would be sensitive to changes the land animals might not notice at first. Oxygen drops. Fine particles irritate gills. Light changes. Temperature shifts. A fish's world is the water's chemistry. When that chemistry turns against it, escape may not be possible. The lake that sustained life can become a basin of death, and then, under the right conditions, a bed of fossils. The idea of ancient lakes as death traps should not erase their normal productivity. Most of the time, they supported life. Fish grew. Insects reproduced. Turtles fed. Birds hunted. Plants rooted along the margins. Amphibians used wet edges. A lake that only killed would not produce a rich ecosystem. Jehol's lakes were dangerous because real habitats are dangerous, not because they were permanently hostile. The same shoreline can be nursery, hunting ground, drinking place, trap, and archive. A juvenile animal drinks there one day and survives. Another returns during a crisis and dies. A leaf falls and is buried. A bird catches a fish. A volcanic pulse changes the water. Over thousands of years, these moments layer together until the living complexity becomes a geological sequence. When those layers are split, the ancient world appears not as a panorama, but as surfaces. A surface with a fish. A surface with a feather. A surface with a bird. A surface with a dinosaur curled in place. Each is thin, incomplete, and silent, but together they create depth. Jehol is not one fossil. It is an accumulation of surfaces that, when read together, becomes a world. The scientific value of Jehol comes partly from the way it connects famous questions to ordinary evidence. Bird origins can sound enormous, almost too large for a single fossil bed, but the question is built from smaller observations. Does this forelimb have the range of motion needed for a wing stroke? Are these feathers symmetrical or asymmetrical? Is the tail shortened or long? Are the fingers fused, free, clawed, reduced? Does the sternum suggest strong flight muscles? Do the teeth remain? Is there a beak? How does the ankle compare with other theropods? Each answer is narrow, but together they alter the map of evolution. The same is true for feather function. A display feather on the tail of Caudipteryx does not explain the origin of flight by itself. A filament around Sinosauropteryx does not prove every dinosaur was feathered. A four-winged microraptor does not settle whether bird flight began in trees or on the ground. But each fossil closes off some old assumptions and opens more precise questions. It becomes harder to claim that feathers evolved only for flight. It becomes easier to see insulation, display, brooding, balance, and aerodynamic experimentation as overlapping functions in different animals. Good paleontology often works this way. It does not replace mystery with certainty all at once. It changes the quality of the uncertainty. Before Jehol, many reconstructions of feather evolution lacked direct evidence from non-avian dinosaurs. After Jehol, the uncertainty became more specific. Which lineages had which structures? How were they arranged on the body? Were they colored? Did they molt? Were they used in social behavior? How did juveniles differ from adults? The questions became more difficult in one sense, but more scientific, because they could be tested against real specimens. The specimens themselves can be visually modest. A viewer expecting the drama of a mounted skeleton may be surprised by how flat and dark many Jehol fossils appear. They are often slabs rather than towering bones. The animal is a stain, a silhouette, a compressed skeleton with feather traces around it. But the quiet appearance is part of their power. A three-dimensional skull can show anatomy. A flattened slab can show anatomy plus surface. The stone gives up depth in exchange for the outline of feathers, skin, and sometimes the last contents of the body. In a museum, people often lean closer to these fossils than they do to giant skeletons. The giant can be understood from across the hall. It announces itself immediately. A Jehol slab asks for attention at a different scale. The eye has to follow the tail, separate the feather halo from the surrounding sediment, notice the fingers, trace the ribs, and recognize the faint shape of a wing. That act of looking resembles the scientific process itself. The evidence does not shout. It waits for careful seeing. Careful seeing also means accepting that some features will remain ambiguous. A dark patch might be feather, skin, bacteria, mineral staining, or some combination. A body outline might be true soft tissue or a decay halo. A cluster inside the abdomen might be gut contents, displaced bones, or material introduced after death. Each interpretation must be tested. Jehol has produced spectacular confidence in some cases, but also caution in others. The beauty of the fossils does not excuse weak inference. If anything, their importance demands more discipline. That discipline is why the Jehol Biota continues to produce research rather than only wonder. New methods allow old specimens to be re-examined. Microscopy reveals structures invisible to earlier workers. CT scanning can separate bones hidden under matrix. Geochemical techniques test organic residues and mineral replacements. Phylogenetic analyses change as new species and characters are added. A fossil discovered decades ago can become scientifically new again when a better question or better method is brought to it. The living world also helps interpret Jehol. Birds show how feathers grow, wear, molt, and function. Crocodilians and birds, as living archosaurs, bracket some aspects of dinosaur biology. Mammals, reptiles, amphibians, and fish provide comparisons for feeding, growth, reproduction, and ecology. But living analogs must be used carefully. No modern animal is Microraptor. No living bird is Confuciusornis. No modern forest is exactly a Jehol forest, analogy guides, but it cannot replace fossil evidence. Still, living birds make Jehol feel close. A crow preening on a roof, a pigeon lifting between buildings, a heron standing at water, a sparrow fluffing itself in winter air, all carry pieces of a story that runs through the early Cretaceous and beyond. Their feathers are not relics, because they are alive and changing, but they are inherited structures, modified through immense time. Jehol shows some of the relatives that make that inheritance visible. A winter bird outside a modern window may be the easiest way to understand the insulation story. It rounds its body, traps air and plumage, covers its feet when it can, and turns metabolism into warmth. Now place a small feathered dinosaur in a cool Jehol morning. The behavior would not have to be identical. The physiology would not have to be identical. But the physical principle is the same. A covering that traps air changes what a small body can endure. This is why ancient climate is not background. A feather in a warm tropical swamp may tell one story. A feather in a cool seasonal volcanic basin tells another. If the Jehol region experienced cold winters or high elevation conditions, then insulation becomes central to daily life. Feathers could allow small dinosaurs and early birds to remain active in conditions that would constrain less insulated animals. Climate does not explain feathers by itself, but it helps explain why feathers mattered. The old phrase "age of reptiles" can make the Mesozoic sound uniform, as if one kind of cold-blooded animal held the planet in a long pause before mammals and birds arrived. Jehol shows how inadequate that phrase is. The Mesozoic held warm-bodied animals, flying reptiles, feathered theropods, early birds, mammals with varied diets, flowering plants beginning to spread, and ecosystems as intricate as any later world. It was not a waiting room for modernity. It was a world fully occupied by its own experiments. Even the non-feathered parts of the Jehol record support that view. The fishes show lake food webs, the insects show plant associations and seasonal activity, the amphibians show wet habitats, the mammals show nocturnal, predatory, climbing, and burrowing possibilities. The pterosaurs show that the air was already a contested and diverse realm. The plants show a transition between older gymnosperm worlds and the coming rise of angiosperms. Dinosaurs remain central, but they are central inside a complete ecosystem. Completeness should not be confused with totality. Jehol is one region, one set of depositional settings, and one slice of early Cretaceous time. Other parts of the world had different climates, animals, plants, and preservation conditions. Large sauropods, iguanodontians, ankylosaurs, early ceratopsians, and many other dinosaurs were living elsewhere in environments Jehol does not fully represent. The importance of Jehol is not that it stands for the entire planet, but that it preserves one world with unusual clarity. That one world, however, was enough to reshape the whole. Once feathered dinosaurs were documented in such detail, reconstructions of related animals elsewhere had to be reconsidered. A skeleton from another continent might not preserve feathers, but if it belonged to a lineage known from feathered relatives, feathers became plausible. Absence of preservation could no longer be treated as proof of absence. Jehol taught paleontologists to see the missing soft tissue around bare bones. This lesson extends to other features. A fossil without color may still have been patterned. A skeleton without stomach contents still belonged to an animal that ate. A bone bed without feathers may still come from animals with skin, display structures, or behaviors that vanished before burial. Jehol is exceptional because it shows what is usually missing. By doing so, it changes how ordinary fossils are imagined. It turns absence into a problem rather than a default. At the same time, Jehol should not encourage careless restoration. Knowing that some relatives were feathered does not justify covering every dinosaur in plumage. Knowing that some birds had bright or dark patterns does not justify painting every fossil with confidence. The correct response to exceptional evidence is not fantasy, but better restraint. Jehol expands possibility while reminding us that each species, formation, and body region requires its own evidence. The physical conditions of the fossils also influence public understanding. A feathered dinosaur in a slab can look less imposing than a mounted predator, and that can make it seem less important to people trained by scale. But paleontology is not a contest of size. Small fossils can answer large questions. A tiny mammal jaw can rewrite mammal history. A feather impression can alter dinosaur reconstructions worldwide. A seed inside a bird can illuminate feeding behavior. Jehol's greatness is often fine-grained. Fine-grained is the right phrase in more than one sense. The sediment was fine enough to receive delicate structures. The scientific work is fine enough to distinguish filaments, veins, bones, and traces. The story itself is fine-grained because it moves through small evidence. A whole animal can be held on a surface no larger than a table. A whole evolutionary transition can be glimpsed in the angle of a feather. Human time feels very short beside this. The Jehol animals lived more than 120 million years ago. That number is easy to say and difficult to feel. It is longer than the time between us and Tyrannosaurus by a wide margin. It is longer than the rise and fall of countless ecosystems. Continents have shifted, seas have opened and closed, mountains have risen and eroded, climates have moved through warmth and ice. Yet a feather from that world can still show its shaft and barbs. The survival of such detail across that distance is almost unreasonable. A feather is not built to last. It is built to grow, function, wear, and be replaced. It is light because life requires lightness. It is delicate because air rewards delicacy. For it to pass from a living body into lake sediment, through burial, compression, mineral change, tectonic history, erosion, quarrying, preparation, and study, and still remain legible, is one of the great accidents of natural history. That accident does not make the science accidental. Once the fossil is found, interpretation becomes disciplined work. Measurements, comparisons, photographs, microscopy, stratigraphy, and debate turn the accident into knowledge. Jehol's fossils are beautiful by chance, but useful by method. Without the method, they would remain curiosities. With it, they become evidence for feather evolution, early bird diversity, Mesozoic ecology, ancient climate, and volcanic preservation. The Jehol Biota also changed how museums communicate dinosaurs to the public. Exhibits increasingly show feathered theropods, early birds beside non-avian relatives, and ecosystems that include small animals as well as giants. This matters because children and adults form durable images from museum halls. A feathered dinosaur displayed with confidence teaches that science changes when evidence changes. It also teaches that extinct animals were not monsters from a separate imagination, but organisms with bodies as specific as living ones. A museum visitor may come for the famous names and leave remembering a smaller fossil. The tiny skeleton with feathers, the bird with claws, the mammal that ate a young dinosaur, the fish lying in perfect profile. These fossils shift attention from spectacle to relationship. They show that the dinosaur age was not only about the largest predator or the heaviest herbivore, it was also about who perched above whom, who hunted in the undergrowth, who fed in the lake, and who settled into mud at the end. In that sense, Jehol is not a detour from the main dinosaur story. It is one of the places where the main story becomes clear. Dinosaurs were diverse, adaptable, and deeply connected to the origins of birds. Their world included feathers before the modern sky existed. Their ecosystems included mammals before mammals became dominant. Their habitats could be cold, volcanic, forested, and lake-filled, not just warm plains under giant feet. Jehol makes the Mesozoic more detailed, and therefore more real. The title of this journey holds 3 anchors: feathered dinosaurs, birds, and ancient lakes. Each anchor supports the others. Without feathered dinosaurs, the bird story loses its visible ancestry. Without birds, the feathered dinosaurs lose one of their longest living consequences. Without ancient lakes, much of the evidence would be gone. The lake is the witness. The feathers are the revelation. The birds are the continuation. A final return to the shoreline brings the pieces together. The water is calm, but the region is not. Volcanoes stand in the distance or beyond the visible horizon. Forest plants crowd the basin. Fish move below. Insects rise and fall. A bird with a beak lands on a branch. A feathered non-avian dinosaur moves through the ferns below it. They are not symbols. They are neighbors, separated by anatomy but joined by ancestry, habitat, and time. One of them may leave no trace. Another may lose a feather that sinks. A fish may die in low oxygen. A sudden event may carry bodies into the basin. Sediment may cover them. Minerals may begin their slow replacement. The lake bottom receives what the living world gives it and keeps only a fraction. That fraction becomes enough, eventually, to alter how a later species understands the word dinosaur. The feather in the stone is still there. It does not move, and yet it changes motion in the mind. It makes a dinosaur quicker. It makes a bird older. It makes a lake deeper. It makes the early Cretaceous less distant, not because the time is short, but because the evidence is intimate. A line along a shaft, small branches to either side, a shadow in pale sediment, and the sense that an entire world once touched that surface. The Jehol Biota also matters because it teaches how misleading a single fossil can be when removed from its ecosystem. A feathered dinosaur alone says one thing. A feathered dinosaur beside early birds, lakefish, insects, pterosaurs, plants, amphibians, mammals, ash beds, and laminated sediments says much more. It places the animal in weather, food, danger, and landscape. It shows that feathers were not abstract evolutionary novelties, but parts of bodies moving through specific habitats. A small predator with insulation in a cool volcanic basin is a different animal from the same skeleton imagined under a generic tropical sun. A bird living beside fish-filled lakes is different from a bird floating in empty evolutionary space. A mammal eating a young dinosaur means more when the plants, prey, burrows, and shoreline are present around it. Context gives the fossil its pressure. It tells us what the animal had to solve. This is why ancient lakes are more than passive containers in the Jehol story. They were selective environments. They produced food, attracted animals, concentrated remains, and created the chemical conditions that could slow decay. They also misled, mixed, filtered, and flattened the living world. Every lake deposit is both generous and biased. It gives details that dry uplands would destroy, but it also favors the animals and events that came within reach of water. The forests away from the lake must have held animals we rarely see. Some lived too far from water to be carried into sediment. Some died where scavengers and weather erased them. Some were small and fragile. Some occupied uplands, slopes, or denser vegetation that the fossil record only touches. Jehol is vivid, But even here, the living world extended beyond the preserved one. The edge of evidence is not the edge of life. That missing life should make the known fossils feel more valuable, not less. A single microraptor is not only a specimen of one animal, but a sign that many other small, feathered bodies moved through the same region and failed to preserve. A Confuciusornis slab represents one individual, yet its abundance points toward populations. Sinosauropteryx is famous, but it stood within a community of animals whose full diversity remains partly hidden. Paleontology works with this imbalance constantly. The animals that preserve well become more familiar than animals that may have been equally common in life, but less likely to fossilize. Large bones survive where small bones vanish. Lake animals preserve where upland animals disappear. Spectacular feathered specimens shape public attention, while fragmentary material may represent species that were ecologically just as important. The record is a map with illuminated regions and dark areas. Jehol illuminates more than most, but it still leaves darkness. We do not know every call, every color, every courtship movement, every predator strategy, every seasonal migration, or every nesting behavior. We know enough to reconstruct a plausible world, not enough to watch it as if standing there with perfect vision. The difference matters. Good deep time narration should bring the world close while leaving room for what cannot be known. That restraint is part of the atmosphere of the fossils themselves. They do not explain themselves in dramatic language. They lie flat, often quiet and gray, with the important detail requiring careful attention. A small bone crosses another. A feather line fades near the edge. A dark patch follows the tail. The viewer brings questions, and the slab answers only some of them. The rest remain in the space between evidence and imagination. If we follow that space back into the Jehol forest, we might stop beside a fallen branch. Beetles work through softened wood. A small mammal noses through leaf litter. A bird lands above, its claws wrapping around bark. A dromaeosaur pauses on the ground, head tilted, feathers lying close to the body. The scene is not arranged around a chase. Most of life is not chasing. It is searching, resting, feeding, listening, adjusting. Predation still exists, but it is only one thread. A predator fails more often than it succeeds. Prey animals are not waiting to be taken. They hide, flee, group together, signal, bite, kick, climb, dive, or stay still. A fish avoids a bird. A lizard avoids a small theropod. A juvenile dinosaur stays close to cover. A mammal waits for darkness. Jehol, like any ecosystem, was shaped as much by avoided deaths as by successful kills. This matters because popular dinosaur stories often overuse violence. The Jehol world certainly had danger, but its deeper interest lies in balance. Feathers balancing heat and display. Lakes balancing life and preservation. Volcanoes balancing fertility and catastrophe. Birds balancing ancestral traits with new flight abilities. Mammals balancing vulnerability with opportunity. The ecosystem is not compelling because everything attacks everything else. It is compelling because everything depends on everything else. Even a volcanic ash layer can be read in more than one way. It can represent death, but also time. It marks a moment that can be dated, correlated, and placed within a sequence. Ash beds help geologists constrain ages and compare layers. They give paleontologists a timeline for biological change. The same material that may have harmed animals in life becomes a measuring tool for understanding when they lived. The commonly cited Jehol interval, around 130 to 120 million years ago under many definitions, places the biota in the Barremian to Aptian stages of the Early Cretaceous. These numbers are not decorative. They separate Jehol from the Jurassic Solnhofen world of Archaeopteryx and from the later Cretaceous world of Tyrannosaurus and Triceratops. Jehol is its own moment, between famous moments, and that middle position is part of its importance. At one end of comparison stands Archaeopteryx from the late Jurassic of Germany, long treated as the classic early bird. At the other stand modern birds, highly modified, toothless, short-tailed, and globally diverse. Jehol fills part of the space between them with many kinds of birds and close relatives. It does not replace Archaeopteryx. It surrounds the question with a richer sample. The origin of birds becomes less dependent on one fossil and more grounded in a community. That community also changed the meaning of flight. Flight was not a switch that turned on once. It was a set of abilities with degrees and contexts. Some animals could glide, some could flap weakly or in bursts, some could fly well enough for daily foraging, some had feathers with no aerial purpose, some had wings that displayed more than they lifted. Jehol shows the air being entered unevenly by different bodies in different ways. The same unevenness applies to the ground. Dinosaurs at Jehol ranged from small predators to beaked herbivores to large feathered tyrannosauroids. They did not share one posture, one skin, one diet, or one ecological role. Their common identity as dinosaurs is real, but it contains enormous variety. The word dinosaur is most accurate when it is allowed to hold that variety, rather than reduced to one familiar silhouette. A child drawing a dinosaur today may add feathers because of places like Jehol. That simple change in a drawing carries a century and a half of scientific argument, fieldwork, preparation, microscopy, and debate. It also carries a different emotional relationship to the past. The dinosaur becomes less like a movie creature and more like an animal with weather on its body. More strange, perhaps, but also more alive. Museums have followed the same shift. A raptor mount may now stand with feathers. A tyrannosauroid relative may be restored with a shaggy coat. Early birds may be displayed beside non-avian dinosaurs rather than in a separate hall. These changes can surprise visitors who learned older images first. But paleontology is not loyalty to childhood pictures. It is loyalty to evidence, even when evidence changes the animal we thought we knew. Jehol is one of the clearest examples of that loyalty. The fossils did not ask whether the old image was convenient. They showed filaments, feathers, wings, claws, beaks, teeth, and tails. Scientists then had to follow. Some interpretations were revised, some reconstructions were abandoned, others were strengthened. The process can feel unsettling, but it is exactly how science remains alive. In that sense, the Jehol Biota is not only a subject of paleontology, it is a lesson in how knowledge changes. A fossil appears. It is described, questioned, compared, challenged, re-examined, and placed into a larger pattern. New fossils complicate the pattern. Better methods refine it. Public images lag behind, then catch up. The ancient world does not change, but our access to it does. The ancient lakes of Jehol also remind us that preservation is an ecological event after death. The body does not become information automatically. It must pass through decay, burial, mineralization, geological survival, and discovery. A feathered dinosaur that dies on exposed ground may vanish completely. Another that reaches quiet lake sediment may become one of the most important fossils ever found. Biology creates the animal. Geology decides whether we meet it. That meeting is separated by deep time, but it is also strangely direct. A person can look at a fossil feather and recognize feather structure without needing to hold the living animal. A rib cage still reads as a rib cage. A claw still curves as a claw. The mind bridges the gap because bodies have continuity, not sameness, but continuity. The Jehol fossils are alien and familiar at the same time, which is why they hold attention so strongly. The ancient lake beds do not preserve sound, but they preserve enough to suggest sound's absence as a loss. No calls remain from Confuciusornis. No wingbeat is recorded from Microraptor. No rustle marks the movement of Sinosauropteryx through plants. No splash follows a fish taken at the surface. The fossils are silent. and the silence is part of their distance. Yet the anatomy says that the living world was not silent at all. The ancient lakebeds do not preserve smell either. Resin, damp mud, algae, ash, wet feathers, decay, plant oils, mammal musk, reptile skin, and volcanic dust are gone. These things would have mattered to the animals. A mammal could read scent. A predator could follow it. A herbivore could detect danger or food. The living Jehol world was sensory in ways the fossil record can only imply. This is where imagination has a careful role. It fills in air, light, and movement around evidence, but it must not replace evidence. We can imagine mist over water because lakes and climate allow it. We can imagine feathers shifting because feathers preserve and living feathers move. We can imagine a bird taking a fish if gut contents and anatomy support fish eating. The strongest ancient scenes are built from small permissions granted by fossils. A weak scene ignores those permissions and invents freely. A strong scene stays close to rock. It knows when to say perhaps, may have, likely, or suggests. It lets uncertainty become part of the mood rather than an obstacle. Jehol benefits from this because the evidence is already rich. It does not require exaggeration. The truth is strange enough. Feathered dinosaurs, early birds, mammals eating dinosaurs, volcanic lakes preserving vanished bodies with delicate surfaces intact. The more restrained version is often more powerful. A microraptor gliding from a branch is enough without turning it into a fantasy creature. A Eutyranus walking through cold forest is enough without making it roar at everything in sight. A Confuciusornis perched above a lake is enough without giving it a modern song. A feather in stone is enough without making it a symbol too quickly. Jehol asks for that kind of patience. The fossils reward close looking. The ecosystem rewards slow reconstruction. The story rewards a voice that moves between fact and image without forcing either one to dominate. It is a dinosaur story, a bird story, a lake story, a volcanic story, and a preservation story. Each part needs the others, and none of them needs to be louder than the evidence allows. Toward the end of the day, the Jehol shore becomes a place of returns. Animals that fed elsewhere come back to water. Birds settle into branches. Small predators test the edge of cover. Fish continue below the surface, invisible until they break it. The lake receives pollen, insects, ash, leaves, and occasionally bodies. Nothing about the scene knows it is important. Importance is added later by survival through stone. Over time, the basins fill, sediments accumulate, volcanic pulses come and go. Species appear, spread, decline, and vanish. The Jehol Biota lasts for millions of years, not as one frozen afternoon, but as a sequence of changing communities. The fossils we know are scattered windows through that sequence. Looking through them, we see continuity and replacement, stability and interruption, life returning again and again to the margins of water. The birds continue beyond Jehol. Some lineages disappear, others lead toward later avian radiations. The non-avian feathered dinosaurs continue for a time in different forms, but their branches eventually end. Mammals remain mostly small until the end Cretaceous extinction changes the world. Flowering plants continue their rise. Pterosaurs persist and diversify, reaching immense sizes later. Jehol is not an ending. It is a chapter from a larger Cretaceous transformation. That larger transformation ends, much later, with the asteroid impact 66 million years ago. Jehol's animals did not see it. More than 50 million years separated them from that catastrophe. But the living birds that survive today carry forward part of the Jehol story through ancestry. Not the exact species, not the extinct branches, but the deeper dinosaurian inheritance of feathers, eggs, wings, and theropod bodies reshaped by time. This distance is important. Jehol is ancient even compared with the famous end of the dinosaurs. It is not a prelude occurring just before extinction. It is a world with its own long future ahead of it. When Sinosauropteryx moved along a lake shore, Tyrannosaurus rex did not yet exist. Triceratops did not yet exist. The last non-avian dinosaur extinction was still unimaginably far away. The Mesozoic had much more to unfold. That perspective helps prevent a common mistake. We often view ancient life by what it leads to. Feathers lead to birds. Mammals lead to us. Flowering plants lead to modern forests. But Jehol's animals did not live as beginnings for later outcomes. They lived as present tense organisms. A Confuciusornis was not an early draft of a bird. It was a successful bird of its own ecosystem. A Microraptor was not a failed bird. It was Microraptor. The value of ancestry is real, but it should not erase the dignity of extinct forms. Branches that end are not failures in any simple sense. They may persist for millions of years, diversify, and shape ecosystems before disappearing. Enantiornithine birds were successful for much of the Cretaceous even though they left no living descendants. Many feathered dinosaurs were successful in their own time. Extinction is not the same as insignificance. The Jehol Biota is full of such significant endings. Whole lineages preserved there have vanished. Their bodies remain as evidence that the history of life is broader than survival into the present. The living world is only the narrow set of branches that made it through. Fossils show the rest of the tree, including branches that were once green, active, and full of animals that had no reason to seem temporary. The feather in the stone belongs to that broader tree. It is not only a clue to birds, it is a remnant of an individual surface, grown from skin, used in life, lost or buried in death, and held by sediment until the present. It asks to be understood scientifically, but it also asks to be seen as something once ordinary. Feathers were not miracles to the animals that carried them. They were bodies. A body is where all the large forces become personal. Climate becomes cold against skin. Evolution becomes a limb that can lift or fail. Volcanism becomes ash in air. Ecology becomes hunger. Predation becomes a shadow moving behind plants. Reproduction becomes an egg, a display, a mate, a juvenile. Preservation becomes the strange chance that one body, among countless bodies, will cross into stone. The ancient lake accepts that body without meaning. Sediment does not know what it covers. It takes fish, leaves, insects, birds, mammals, and dinosaurs according to physics and chemistry, not importance. Meaning arrives later, when another animal with hands and questions opens the rock. The fossil becomes evidence because a mind recognizes pattern. The past becomes knowable because matter retained form. In the end, Jehol is not a story about dinosaurs becoming birds in a single dramatic leap. It is a story about a living region where many feathered bodies shared lakes, forests, and volcanic ground. Some flew, some glided, some walked, some hunted, some fed on plants or seeds or fish. Some were birds, some were not. The difference mattered, but so did the closeness. The water is still again. A feather rests on the surface for a moment before it sinks. Around the lake, the forest continues without ceremony. A bird shifts on a branch. A small dinosaur moves through the ferns. Fish turn below the ash-dusted light. The feather reaches the bottom, lies against fine sediment, and begins the long passage from living surface to fossil trace. The animal that lost it is gone. The lake is gone. The volcanoes are quiet or eroded away. The forests have changed beyond recognition. But in a split slab of pale stone, a central shaft and branching barbs remain visible. They are small, almost fragile, and yet they carry one of the largest truths of the dinosaur age. The past was more feathered, more complex, and more alive than we once imagined. There is one more reason Jehol matters, and it sits beyond the famous feathered dinosaurs themselves. The biota shows that deep time is not only a sequence of replacements, where one kind of animal disappears and another takes its place. It is also a record of overlap. Birds and non-avian feathered dinosaurs overlap. Pterosaurs and birds overlap. Mammals and dinosaurs overlap. Older gymnosperm forests and early flowering plants overlap. Volcanic destruction and ecological productivity overlap. The world does not wait for one story to finish before beginning another. It layers stories together until the fossil record catches a few of them on the same surface. Overlap is what makes the Jehol world feel so close to transition without reducing it to transition alone. A bird with a beak can perch above a dinosaur with feathers. A mammal can feed on a young dinosaur while remaining part of a mostly dinosaur-dominated landscape. A pterosaur can pass through the air even as birds diversify beneath it. A lake can preserve fish, leaves, insects, and winged animals in the same sequence. Each overlap complicates the older picture, but it also makes the ecosystem more believable, because living worlds are always made of old inheritances and new experiments existing at the same time. The ancient lakes also create a rhythm of return. In dry intervals, shorelines shrink and animals concentrate near water. In wetter times, plants spread and the basin margins soften. During volcanic episodes, ash enters the system and may change water, air, and soil. Between disruptions, the ecosystem resumes. Fish spawn. Insects emerge. Dinosaurs feed. Birds molt. Mammals breed. The fossils preserve moments of interruption, but the existence of so many fossils also implies long stretches of ordinary continuity. Catastrophe alone cannot build a biota. Life has to keep coming back. That returning life is perhaps the quietest part of the Jehol story. We notice the animals that died because they are available to us, but the fossil beds were made by populations that lived, reproduced, and persisted through generations. For every Confuciusornis preserved, many flew away. For every Sinosauropteryx entombed, others hunted and nested and died elsewhere without trace. The exceptional fossil is a survival of evidence, not a measure of how often life failed. A preserved death can reveal a thriving world if we read it with enough care. The bird outside a modern window is not a Jehol bird, but it is one of the reasons Jehol remains emotionally powerful. A living bird makes the fossil less isolated. Feathers are still here, still growing from skin, still worn by animals that balance, breathe, signal, and survive. The path from a Jehol bird to a modern bird is not straight through every fossil we have named, and many Jehol lineages vanished. But the broader dinosaurian inheritance continues in the living sky, making the ancient lake deposits feel less like a closed chapter and more like a preserved passage in a longer book. The book is not written for us, and most of its pages are missing. That is why each exceptional deposit becomes precious. Solnhofen gives us Archaeopteryx and a Jurassic lagoon world. The Morrison Formation gives us giant dinosaurs of late Jurassic floodplains. The Hell Creek Formation gives us the last non-avian dinosaurs before the asteroid. Jehol gives us the feathered and lake-filled Early Cretaceous, where birds are already diverse, and dinosaur skin is no longer what older reconstructions assumed. Each window is incomplete, but together they make the dinosaur age less like myth and more like history. History, in this sense, is not only dates and names, it is the shape of a hand, the texture of a feather, the sediment around a rib cage, the difference between a long bony tail and a shortened one, the tiny bones of a fish preserved inside a larger body. It is the recognition that a fossil is both specimen and event. The Jehol Biota gives many such events, and their accumulation lets scientists reconstruct not just who was present, but what kinds of relationships made the ecosystem work. Those relationships were never fixed for all time. If we could move through the Jehol interval across millions of years, we would see species change, lakes shift, shorelines migrate, eruptions alter landscapes, and communities reorganize. The Jehol Biota is often spoken of as if it were one world, and that is useful, but it was also a duration. Generations passed. Lineages split, local habitats appeared and disappeared. The fossils compressed that long change into a set of known formations, but the living reality would have been dynamic, uneven, and constantly revised by the earth beneath it. A feather sinking through lake water is a small image, but it can hold the whole system if we let it. Above the feather is the animal that lost it, with muscles, nerves, skin, and behavior. Around that animal is a forest with food, shelter, rivals, and predators. Around the forest is a volcanic basin with changing lakes and seasons. Around the basin is a moving continent on a warm Cretaceous Earth. Below the feather is sediment, chemistry, burial, and the long patience of stone. When the slab is finally opened, the feather has become a meeting point between those scales. It is biological because it grew from a body. It is ecological because it belonged to an animal in a community. It is geological because it survived through sediment and rock. It is historical because it changed human understanding. Few objects are so small and so expansive at once. A Jehol feather can fit in the hand, but the explanation for it reaches through climate, evolution, volcanism, and ancestry. This is why the Jehol Biota remains one of the defining fossil records of the dinosaur age. It does not give us the largest dinosaurs, and it does not mark the final extinction. Its power is more subtle. It gives the surface back to animals that had too often been known only by bones. It shows birds becoming diverse while still carrying ancient traits. It shows non-avian dinosaurs wearing feathers for reasons older and broader than flight. It shows lakes acting as habitats and archives. It shows a world where the familiar and the alien are inseparable. The feather in the limestone-like lake sediment is still quiet. It does not announce the revolution it helped create. It does not explain bird origins, climate, or volcanic preservation by itself. It only lies there, with a shaft and branching traces, dark against pale rock. But because it is there, the ancient shore becomes easier to see. The water darkens, the conifers rise, a small dinosaur moves through ferns, a bird shifts above the lake, and the dinosaur age becomes feathered again. Even after all of this, Jehol should not be treated as a finished answer. It is better understood as a continuing conversation between rock and interpretation. New specimens can still change relationships among species. Better dating can refine the timing of formations. New chemical work can test old ideas about preservation. New comparisons with living birds can improve our understanding of feather function, flight, growth, and color. A fossil bed this rich does not become exhausted simply because its most famous discoveries have already entered textbooks. It keeps returning to science because each specimen is more than a name. It is a body in sediment, with context, structure, and unanswered questions still attached. That continuing nature fits the Jehol world itself. The ancient animals were not static representatives of groups. They were populations in motion across generations. A bird hatched, grew, replaced feathers, avoided predators, found food, and perhaps reproduced. A small dinosaur survived one winter and not another. A fish school shifted as lake conditions changed. A plant community responded to ash, rainfall, and succession. Over thousands of years, small changes accumulated. Over millions, the community itself changed. When we say Jehol, we compress all of that into one name, but the name contains many mornings, many lakes, many deaths, and many ordinary lives that never fossilized. The continuity between those lives and the evidence is fragile. A feather does not preserve because it is important. A skeleton does not remain articulated because it belongs to a famous lineage. A mammal does not keep its stomach contents because the future needs a surprising example of Mesozoic predation. Preservation follows physical rules, and most of the time those rules are destructive. This makes the surviving fossils feel less like possessions and more like narrow permissions. They permit us to say some things about color, feathers, diet, climate, and flight. They do not permit us to say everything. The most trustworthy reconstruction is one that knows the difference. That difference is also where wonder can remain honest. There is no need to pretend we can see every detail of Jehol as if a camera had been left beside the lake. We cannot. But we can see enough to know that the older picture was incomplete. We can know that some dinosaurs were feathered, that birds were already diverse, that mammals were more ecologically active than once assumed, that volcanic lakes could preserve delicate remains, and that early Cretaceous ecosystems were filled with overlap and experiment. These are not vague impressions. They are grounded in fossils, in sediment, in measured anatomy, and in the repeated pattern of discoveries from the region. The final image can stay small. Not a panorama of every animal at once. Not a battle. Not an eruption filling the sky, just a lake surface in the late light, with a feather drifting down. It turns once as it sinks. Above it, the animal that lost it is already moving on, alive in a world that does not know it will become evidence. Around the shore, plants hold the last warmth of the day. Fish move below. Insects gather over the water. Somewhere in the trees, an early bird settles its wings. Somewhere lower, a feathered dinosaur slips through cover. The feather reaches the bottom and lies on fine sediment. Perhaps it is covered quickly. Perhaps it waits until the next thin layer settles. The water above it changes with season and weather. More leaves fall. More animals come and go. Ash enters the basin. Sediment thickens. The lake shifts, fills, and disappears. Rock forms. Time passes through scales that no animal on that shore could have sensed. The feather becomes part of a layer, the layer part of a formation, the formation part of a landscape that will one day be cut, quarried, split, studied, and placed under light. When that light finally reaches it, the feather is no longer only a feather. It is a sign of a body, a climate, a lake, a lineage, and a revolution in understanding. It tells us that the dinosaur age had textures the old images missed. It tells us that birds were not sudden arrivals, but living branches growing from a deeper theropod tree. It tells us that the boundary between categories can be thinner than the sediment that preserves them. It tells us that small things can carry enormous histories if the rock is fine enough, and the questions are patient enough. So the Jehol Biota remains, not as a lost world fully recovered, but as one of the clearest openings we have into the feathered Mesozoic. Ancient lakes held what they could. Volcanoes marked the layers, forests fed the animals, dinosaurs wore feathers. Birds still carried claws and teeth or long tails in some lineages. Mammals moved in the margins with more strength than once imagined. And beneath all of it, the sediment waited, receiving the quiet debris of life until a feather, a fish, a bird, a dinosaur, and an entire vanished shoreline could be read again from stone. The restraint of that ending is important because Jehol does not need to be made larger than it is. Its real scale is already immense. A basin in northeastern China becomes a record of global importance because the local conditions preserved what most of the planet destroyed. A few formations become central to questions about feathers, flight, early birds, volcanic death, lake ecology, and the shape of dinosaur evolution. The site is specific, but the implications travel widely. Every feathered reconstruction in a museum, every explanation that birds are living dinosaurs, every modern image of a small theropod with plumage owes something to the evidence from places like Jehol. The Jehol Biota also changes how we think about extinction by showing how much can vanish without vanishing completely. The animals themselves are gone, but not every part of them disappeared. Their forms survived as impressions. Their relationships survived as stomach contents and associations. Their environments survived as sediment. Some of their broader inheritance survived in birds. Extinction removed the living lineages, but fossilization allowed selected moments to cross into another kind of existence. Not life, not memory, but evidence. It is a colder kind of survival, yet it is survival enough for knowledge. For the animals, there was no knowledge of any of this. A Confuciusornis did not know it was early. A microraptor did not know it would trouble the distinction between ground and air. A Sinosauropteryx did not know its body covering would become a turning point in dinosaur imagery. A Repenomamus did not know its last meal would challenge assumptions about Mesozoic mammals. The scientific meaning belongs to us, but the life belonged to them, and the best reconstructions keep that separation intact. That separation keeps the past from becoming a mirror that only reflects human questions. Jehol answers human questions, but it was not made for them. It was made by sediment, water, ash, growth, hunger, reproduction, and decay. It was made by animals solving their own immediate problems in a world with no humans in it. This is part of its dignity. The fossils are useful to us because they were once indifferent to us. They carry truth precisely because they began as ordinary pieces of a world that did not need an audience. Return one last time to the split stone. The surface is flat beneath the light. A feather lies there with the patience of mineral and shadow. Around it, everything that once moved is gone. The lake current, the insect swarms, the small feet in mud, the wing beats above water, the ash settling through air, the soft movement of plumage on a living body. What remains is not the world itself, but a doorway narrow enough to be overlooked and clear enough to change the view beyond it. Through that doorway, the Jehol shore stays visible. Conifers and gingos stand against an early Cretaceous sky. Fish turn below the dark water. Birds keep their ancient claws. Dinosaurs carry feathers for warmth, display, balance, or air. Mammals move close to the ground. Volcanoes wait in the distance, not always erupting, but always part of the region's deep character. The feather settles into sediment, and the lake closes over it. More than 120 million years later, the stone opens, and the dinosaur age is no longer bare. That is the quiet correction Jehol leaves behind. Dinosaurs were not one texture, one temperature, one way of moving through the world. Some were immense and scaly. Some were small and feathered. Some became birds. Some shared trees with birds. Some hunted with claws under plumage. Some fed with beaks near lakes where fish and insects tied the shore to the water. The ancient world was not simpler because it was older. In many ways, it was as layered, specialized, and surprising as the world outside today, only arranged with different plants, different animals, and different futures still unwritten. The feather remains the simplest proof, not because it explains everything, but because it refuses the old emptiness. It gives the body an edge. It gives the air a participant. It gives the lake a witness. In the pale stone of northeastern China, the feather is small enough to miss, but once seen, it changes the animals around it. The dinosaur age becomes warmer, stranger, and closer to the living sky. A bird shifts on a branch. A small dinosaur passes below. The lake holds still. The sediment receives the trace. The trace is enough to return us to scale. A feather can be lifted by a faint current, but the history that carries it is continental. A small dinosaur can vanish behind ferns, but its lineage can reshape the sky. A lake can seem still, but its sediments can hold a revolution in understanding. Jehol is built from these contrasts. Small surfaces and large meanings, local basins and global consequences, individual deaths and evolutionary patterns. It asks us to look carefully before we decide what the dinosaur age was. Looking carefully does not make the world less mysterious. It makes the mystery better placed. We no longer wonder vaguely whether dinosaurs and birds might be connected. We ask how feathers changed, how flight developed, how early birds differed from one another, how volcanic lakes preserved delicate tissue, and how small animals lived under the shadow of larger ones. The questions become sharper, and sharper questions bring the ancient world closer without pretending to complete it. The Jehol shore, then, is not a fantasy shoreline. It is a reconstruction built from fossils, sediments, chemistry, comparison, and caution. It has missing parts, but the parts we have are strong. Feathered dinosaurs stood there. Birds flew there. Fish lived beneath the water. Mammals moved through the margins. Plants, unlike most modern forests, shaped the light and food. Ash entered the basin. Fine mud covered bodies and feathers. The details are enough to let the scene stand quietly on its own. And in that quiet, the final image can remain almost motionless. A slab of stone rests under a human hand. On it, a feather spreads as a dark impression, neither alive nor fully gone. It came from an animal in a world of lakes and volcanoes, forests and flight, hunger and weather. The body vanished. The ecosystem vanished. The age changed. But the feather stayed, and with it stayed the evidence that dinosaurs were never as bare, simple, or distant as they once seemed. Perhaps that is the clearest way to leave Jehol, not with certainty about every movement, but with a corrected sense of possibility. The dinosaur age held more kinds of bodies than the old images allowed. Some were enormous and shook floodplains far from these lakes. Some were light enough to move through branches. Some carried feathers without flying. Some became birds. Some shared the air with pterosaurs and the ground with mammals. The Jehol Biota does not make the Mesozoic smaller by adding detail. It makes it larger. The detail also makes it more fragile. A feather impression depends on conditions that almost never occur. A stomach content fossil depends on death, burial, and timing so exact that it feels improbable even after it is found. A lake deposit can be destroyed by erosion before anyone sees it. A specimen can be damaged by careless collection. Knowledge of deep time is built from rare survivals, and rare survivals ask for patience. They ask to be protected, studied, compared, and revised when better evidence appears. That patience is the opposite of turning fossils into monsters or simple icons. Jehol's animals were not designed to amaze us, though they do. They were not symbolic, though they have become symbols. They were living organisms in a specific early Cretaceous landscape, and their value begins there. The feathered dinosaur matters first because it was real, warm or warmer than expected, textured, responsive, vulnerable, and part of a food web beside ancient water. So the final silence belongs to the stone. The slab does not need to speak loudly. Its surface holds a feather, and the feather holds a change in understanding. Around it, the vanished lake can be imagined only carefully. Fish below, ash above, birds in the branches, dinosaurs in the ferns, mammals near the roots, and sediments settling through still water. The world is gone, but the trace remains, fine and dark, waiting where the lake left it. It remains there without urgency, as if the long argument it helped create belongs entirely to others. In the rock, it is only a mark. In science, it is part of a pattern. In the imagination, it becomes a shoreline, a body, a season, and a reminder that evidence can be delicate and still overturn something massive. The Jehol Biota gives that lesson again and again. A small fossil can widen the dinosaur age. A lake bed can preserve the edge of a wing. A trace of plumage can connect an extinct animal to the living birds that cross the modern sky. And when the slab is closed, the feather remains what it always was, the leftover surface of a life that once moved through air, weather, and light. That is why the final understanding should stay close to the fossil rather than float above it. The Jehol world was not made of conclusions. It was made of animals and lakes, ash and plants, bodies warming in cold air, wings testing branches, fish turning under a dim surface, and sediment settling grain by grain. The conclusions came later, when those grains had hardened and split open. What they revealed was not a fantasy of feathered dinosaurs, but a record of them, quiet enough to require care and strong enough to change the shape of deep time. The last impression is therefore not one of spectacle, but of precision. A feather is preserved because circumstances were precise. A lineage is understood because comparisons are precise. A lost ecosystem becomes visible because many small facts are allowed to remain small before they are joined together. In that patience, Jehol keeps its power. It does not shout across 120 million years. It waits in fine stone, and when the stone opens, the evidence is still there. It is enough to imagine the slab cooling under the room light, the ancient mark unchanged by attention, the feather still holding its narrow form. Around it, the vanished lake does not return completely. It returns only as evidence allows: water, ash, branch, bird, dinosaur, sediment, and the fine dark line of a surface that deep time did not erase. There the story rests, not finished, but held, a quiet fossil, a changed understanding, and a dinosaur age with feathers along its edges. The lake is gone, but the line remains, and the line is enough. In that thin surviving line, the feathered world stays close to the surface, quiet, exact, and still readable after all that time, still in stone,